Okay, just waiting for some people to filter in, and then we'll see if anyone wants to call in as well. And I've got a few things I could read out just to get started. Right, so the topic we're discussing today is whether Jesus existed or not. This is the question whether Jesus existed as a historical person, not a question of whether he was a god or anything like that, because the odds of that are very low and it would be impossible to work out using a historical method. So we're working on, was there a real person, just a regular guy who existed and started this cult, or was he someone who it was basically made up, like a fictional character like Hercules or Romulus, those kind of people. So first thing I wanted to do, just to set the scene, give people a chance to filter in and maybe call in, is to look at an article on Big Think, written by Paul Ratner, where he lists three ways, three sources that we know prove Jesus existed. Because I thought this was quite an interesting article. He starts off with listing the writings. So he's got three categories: writings, eyewitnesses, and artifacts. So for his list of writings, he's put down Paul, Josephus, Pliny, and Tacitus. So Josephus, Pliny, and Tacitus are too late to be independent sources. They rely on the Gospels at best. So Josephus, Pliny, and Tacitus are not evidence. We have to put them to one side. You need to have independent sources. And then Paul is actually evidence against the historicity of Jesus, so I don't think that works either. So that his whole first section of the article is straight out the window. His second listed piece of evidence is eyewitnesses. The idea that we have eyewitnesses of the existence of Jesus. But when you look at how this is written in the article, actually, I'll drop the article link in the chat if I can, just so people can see what we're talking about. And for anyone later who wants to go and check, so I can get to the chat window. There you go. Drop the article link into the chat. So the second piece of evidence he comes up with is that the Gospels, or whatever writings, come from eyewitnesses, and the evidence he provides for this is the dating for when they were written. He just goes, people could live till the age of 80. This is less than 80 years for some of them. Therefore, they were written by eyewitnesses, which is not how history works. I mean, that's a bit like saying that two people lived on opposite ends of the United States and they both lived at the same time. Therefore, one of them is an eyewitness of the other. That's not how logic works. You would have to have evidence for them being an eyewitness, like them saying that they're an eyewitness, which we don't have in any early Christian sources. So that one's a wash as well. It's got two pieces of evidence proposed, and both of them aren't evidence. And then the third thing the article claims is to have artifacts of Jesus. That would be really exciting to have like a physical piece of evidence, not just a writing that proved that Jesus existed. But then all he comes up with is articles that he admits are actually fakes. So his third listed piece of evidence is something that he admits is not evidence. So we're 0 for 3 on that list. That's just that was truly appalling. And I think his cited source for this was Simon Gathercole, who wrote an article in the Guardian and did a real mess of it. Is totally unaware of the evidence of the scholarship. And then towards the end of the article, there's an interesting line. Let's take a caller. I can leave this off. Hello, Dan. You're anyway. We were back on. Yeah, so there's a line towards the end of it, which is Eric Mayers, apparently, who's a professor at Duke University, said, "I don't know any mainstream scholar who doubts the historicity of Jesus, and no one who is serious doubts that he's a historical figure. No one who is serious." So this is an attempt at a well-poisoning fallacy. But also, Duke University is a Christian apologetics school. So this isn't a historian, this is a theologian talking. And when he says that there are no scholars, no one that's serious who doubts that he's a historical figure, there are a load of PhD scholars who have gone on record with, with relevant PhDs in history or theology or religious studies who do doubt whether Jesus was a historical figure. So there's Thomas Brodie, Richard Carrier, Raphael Latasta, Robert M. Price, Thomas L. Thompson, Philip Davies, Hector Avalos, Arthur Droge, Arthur Droge, Carl Ruck, David Madison, J. Harold Ellens, Herman Dietering, Zebra Crook, Kurt Knoll, Emmanuel Foe, James Crossley, Justin Megid, Darren Slade, Steve Mason, Richard C. Miller, John Kloppenborg, Tom Dijkstra, Francesca Stavrokopoulou, Burton Mack, Robert Funk, and Gerd Ludemann, all who are professional PhD scholars and who have expressed in the public record that they doubt whether Jesus was a real person. So anyone who says no serious scholar doubts this is just lying or ignorant. And unfortunately, that's the state we're in. So if anyone wants to call in to talk about Jesus, like whether he existed or didn't, or just wants to throw their oar in, welcome to do so. If not, I can carry on waffling, but I think it's more interesting when there's a back and forth conversation on this. Okay, no callers at the moment. I can carry on. So ways that we know Jesus didn't exist, or at least can strongly suspect that he didn't exist. I've covered a lot of this before, but the historical context is that it was quite common to have these deities that you would see visions of, and you would worship them, and they would give you eternal life, or make you part of a community or something like that. Which was quite appealing in a time when there wasn't really social security or anything like that. It was difficult if you had a tough time, your crops failed, you got ill, or anything like that. So lacking an actual family, you could join this pseudo family, a group of people that would treat you as if you were family. And this was quite common among Hellenistic mystery cults, which is appropriate for the time. After Alexander the Great's reign and influence spread Greek culture basically across the Mediterranean area. And these things tended to have things like baptisms and ritual meals, which you can see in Christianity. So I think there's no doubt really that Christianity was a mystery cult. But who was the founder? Was it a real guy, Jesus, or was it a different real guy like Peter, or maybe Paul, James, John, those guys? I don't think it was Paul, although some people have argued that Paul is the founder of Christianity just because his writings are the earliest, but there were earlier writings that we're not allowed to see. They were all taken, destroyed, lost. We don't get to read them, so we're stuck with Paul being the earliest account we have. But even Paul says that he joined the cult a bit later, like at least 3 years down the line. And then he wrote about 15 or so years after that. So our first accounts of Christianity are roughly 20 years after the start of the cult. What else we got? And anyone want to call in and chat? Hello, we have Daniel. Let me just click on that. Hi, Daniel, you're currently on mute.
Am I unmuted now?
Yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you now.
Okay, how you doing, man?
All right. Thanks for calling in.
No problem, man. Thanks for letting me speak. I had a few questions for you. Well, first of all, do you believe that the historical Jesus ever existed?
No, I don't think so. I don't think the evidence is good enough. It's possible, but it's not likely.
Okay. Do you believe in Bart D. Herman's work? Do you do you think that Bar Herman is a trusted, for the most part, reliable historian? And we can't say that he's a Christian apologetic. He's not a historian because, I mean, we both know he's an agnostic atheist. So there's no bias involved, not on my part. But do you believe in his work?
Some of his work's pretty good. Most of what he does is to publicize the findings of experts in the field. So, like, he'll find a load of different scholars that have done very detailed work, and then he'll summarize and report back what they found. He does some of his own work in textual criticism as well, which is his own training. He's not a historian. He actually he's got his PhD in theology from a Christian university. It was a Princeton Theological Seminary.
I would have to check that. I thought he was for sure a qualified historian. I know that he
has his PhD is in theology. His master's is in divinity, and this is from Princeton Theological Seminary. So he's actually trained in Christian apologetics. And what he did was, as he grew out of his faith, he started to change his tack and use sort of more critical methods. And in textual criticism, he's great. He's written a fantastic book on forgery in the New Testament. And how Christians fabricated a lot of documents. So, like, if you're raising him as a reliable, a valuable scholar, I'm sure you would agree that there are forgeries in the New Testament.
Well, yeah, I mean,
when it comes to historicity, he's not a historian. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think that, I mean, the only evidence that we have of anything being forgery, from what I can understand, is some of the Dead Sea Scrolls were counted as fake, but however, not all of them were. Of course, whenever you know that you have a popular discovery like that, people are going to try to fabricate something for fame. But I do know that there is still the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they are counted as authentic. They are actually in a museum. But I wanted to ask you about this, since we both kind of agree with Bart D. Ehrman, and I don't agree with all of his work, but I wanted to ask you if you could explain this to me, because this is actually a quote from him. And it says that I think that the evidence is just so overwhelming that Jesus existed that it's silly to talk about him not existing. I don't know anyone who is a responsible historian who is actually trained in the historical method, or anyone who is a biblical scholar who does this for a living, who gives any other credence to all or any of this. So he's basically saying that if we say that the historical Jesus never existed, then we're not looking at it from a scholarly historical eye. Because
I just read out a list. I just read out a list of over 20 different experts with PhDs in the field who do doubt that Jesus existed. So that's clearly wrong. He doesn't know what he's talking about.
Well, you said that they do doubt, but you didn't say that they proved that he didn't exist.
No, did you read what Bart Ehrman said? Bart Ehrman said even doubting. So he's clearly wrong.
Well, yeah, but he also says that the evidence is so overwhelming that it's silly to even talk about his non-existence.
I mean, if you want to actually provide the evidence, that would be good.
What kind of evidence do you want?
Well, what evidence is he talking about?
As far as all of his evidence, if you want, I can go grab his book real quick and I can read it to you.
I've read the book several times, but I mean, if you want to refresh your memory, that's fine.
Yeah, let's go over a couple things in the book.
Yeah.
All right.
Do that. So I just wanted to address that particular claim about no one, no qualified scholar doubts it is very clearly false. So Ehrman is wrong about that.
Okay. So
and also, it's worth pointing out that this book, I take it you mean Did Jesus Exist? That was written in 2012. So he wrote that before the scholarship against historicity. So nothing in that book is particularly relevant about the arguments for mythicism that were published 2 years after that book was published.
So you're telling me that this whole book is wrong?
So it was written in ignorance of the arguments for mythicism. I mean, obviously, he's not a time traveler. He couldn't know what was going to be written in a couple of years. So, I mean, we can still work with the evidence, but it's like in a vacuum of scholarship. The only scholarship he could have been relying on arguing for historicity would be from 1912. So it's not exactly up to date, but we can talk about it.
Okay, because whether or not there has been any updates, it's really not my main point. But I'm actually, I know that you like, and last time I didn't have any, get out. I didn't have any links available. But like the stuff I was saying, like I know what I'm saying isn't like you can look it up, but if you want some of the links about what I'm saying and check the credibility, then feel free to do that.
If you've got any links to scholarship, that'd be good. I'm less interested in like casual articles and pop culture stuff. But
well, I mean, see, my approach is that I have a more powerful approach than to try and find every documentary and scrounge up people that agree with me and use that as my criteria to validate my point of view. But because it's more powerful than all that. Because what I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to revisit our last conversation, but I mean, we do know that the last was basically the law of causality. And, I didn't really clarify some things. But anyway, back to Bart D. Herman, I'll get to all that. But, so you believe that there was no historical, so I'm guessing that you would believe that there was no divine Jesus either, that this was all created?
Yeah, then obviously no divine Jesus, and the odds arguing in favor of the lack of a divine Jesus, like millions or billions to one, whereas the historical Jesus is a lot more difficult to ascertain just because it's weak evidence either way.
Okay, so good. So you believe that the divine Jesus was created or invented by man, is what you're saying? That's actually one of my questions.
Well, so the divine Jesus is created or invented by man in either case, regardless of whether a historical Jesus existed or not. He was either a real guy who was mythologized, or he was a myth who was historicized. So
basically, what you're saying is, what you're saying is that he was, whether he existed or not, he wasn't divine, is what you're saying.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, all right, good. Let's get into that. Another question. Have you ever lied or heard anyone else lie to make themselves look worse?
I mean, make themselves look worse in what way? There's plenty of people who've lied in order to take the blame onto themselves in order to like rescue someone else. So yeah, I mean that happens a lot.
Can you give me? No, I'm not. That's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about to make themselves look worse. As far as that's one of the things about the credibility of historicity. Is one of the things they check is the honesty of the person writing it. Because if the person was creating a story, they're not going to write in that they were a coward, or they ran, or they lied, or they denied the Son of God. So
unless they think that lying is a positive. So, for example, Paul explicitly says that he is
right. That makes sense because I mean, one of the commandments is not to lie. But okay, okay. Have you ever lied or ever heard anyone else lie to cause suffering or death on themselves?
Yeah. So martyrdom is a whole thing. A lot of people believe that they'll receive some
but martyrism for allowing yourself to be executed. That's the question. Why? Have you ever heard of anyone, or have you yourself, has ever lied to cause themselves suffering, pain, and death?
Yeah, absolutely. People lie to save their friends and family. This is a thing.
No, that's not what I'm talking about. It's lying. You're talking about doing something honest and compassionate. I'm talking about lying, doing something dishonest.
I'm talking about lying. I'm talking about taking the blame for something you didn't do in order to save someone else. I mean, something as basic and simple as pretending that you were driving a car so that you can take on the points on your license because someone else is actually driving it. If people lie like this in a lot of ways to protect other people who are close to them.
Okay, well, that doesn't make sense in this scenario. I mean, I don't. I mean,
what is the scenario? What are you looking at specifically?
Well, I got one more question. Can you tell me the three motives for doing something unlawful or immoral? And which we mentioned this, I touched on this on our last conversation, but I didn't clarify like everything. But that's basically what I'm doing now. Yeah. So whenever somebody commits a crime or does something at like a act of immoralism or anything like that, can you tell me what the three motives are for committing a certain crime?
I don't know about three motives, but obviously the early Christians would have been committing an illegal act just by meeting each other in a church.
Well, I'm not necessarily. House. Yeah, I'm not necessarily talking about Christians. I'm talking about modern day.
Why modern day? We're talking about ancient history.
Well, it can be ancient history. It's actually all through time. There's three motives to do something unethical, unlawful, immoral, and it's power, money, or sex. Those are the main three motives. Those are the top three motives.
Which one of those do you think the Christians were motivated by when they met as a group illegally under Roman rule?
That was my question to you, which
so they motivated by, I suppose it's power, isn't it? Because they believe that they'll receive an eternal.
But I think that can't be the case, because if that was the case, then why did Paul give up his high position in the synagogue if it was for power?
Well, I mean, how do you know Paul had a high position in the synagogue?
Well, I mean, there's documents on that, you know.
Really?
There's recordings of Paul. Like, I mean, we all know that Paul existed. We can't deny Paul's existence.
Sure. And how do you know Paul was high up in the synagogue?
Because, I mean, so you're saying he wasn't? Like, you're saying that.
No, I'm not saying he wasn't. I'm asking, how do you know that? How do you know? What's your source?
Well, hold on. If you want a specific source.
Yeah, I'm trying to follow the historical method. So anytime someone makes a claim, I go, okay, what's your source for that? How reliable is the source? What's the date of it? You know, how close to the actual events are we? And that's how we want to treat every single claim, without exception.
I mean, it really doesn't. I mean, yeah, you can treat every claim like that, but it's not gonna do anything to my main point. It's not gonna affect it in any way.
I mean, if it doesn't matter to the point, you can skip over it and get to the point.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, I'm getting to it because I'm actually using your questions to see how it makes sense for a historical Jesus to have never existed whenever we both agree that Christianity was the highest rising religion and probably one of the most dangerous times. And one of the things that I'm kind of curious about was, first of all, if it was methodical, like you've mentioned that it could be, then I'm kind of curious why on the book that it says the triumph of Christianity, which means the rise of Christianity, if it was a myth, at the bottom it says how a forbidden religion swept the world. So if it was forbidden, obviously it wasn't considered lawful, so they were breaking the law by practicing a forbidden religion. And how did it sweep the world? And what were the reasons for doing it if it just ended up in martyrism? And if you want to tell me that nobody was martyred, we can get into that. But my main point is, if they made it up, if Jesus never existed, then why are they making up a story that's going to cause them all type of pain, suffering, and eventually death? And Paul himself even had been shipwrecked, stoned, beaten with whips, imprisoned. And I'm just curious, like, why? So if there is no such thing as a historical or divine Jesus, then I'm kind of curious as to why, which you claim that everything about history, according to the apostles and the martyrs, are pretty much false. So I'm just wondering, what was the motivation? Like, I mean, if you want to fabricate a story to cause pain and suffering, why even use a story? Why not just, go, what is it, an emo? Why don't you just cut yourself? I mean, if you want to die, why don't you just kill yourself? I mean, why is it that he allowed himself to go through this pain and suffering for the sake of Christianity, which you claim isn't true, and just to ultimately, walk himself to his death willingly.
In most cases, though, so most people within religions actually believe it's true. So when you say, like, for the sake of a made-up story, it tends to just be the leaders who know the stuff is made up. But even then, they'll say it's like allegorically true. Like it's conveying a deeper truth or something like that.
Right. So what you're saying is that he basically allowed all these afflictions on him just to conceal a lie, because it couldn't have been the truth, right?
Well, so people can be honestly wrong. You can believe in something.
Okay. So you think he might have
even
been,
if it's not actually true.
So you think he might have been deceived? You think that him and everybody else was just deceived and they hallucinated, or they were mentally ill, or they were crazy?
It's nigh impossible to tell the difference, really, between someone who honestly believes and someone who's pretending to believe. So it's quite difficult unless you have some evidence otherwise.
Well, yeah, I would think that one of the most self-explanatory things would be, if you're willing to die for that truth, as far as, and I'm not talking about suicide. We're not talking about kamikazes. We're talking about somebody walking up to a piece of log with a big executor standing there with no shirt and an iron belt with a huge axe, and you just lay your head down to get beheaded with no resistance. That's kind of more of what I'm talking about, because I'm not talking about wrecking it. I mean, people die for what they think is true, but people don't willingly walk themselves to their own death for the sake of that truth because they think it might be a lie. It just doesn't make sense at all.
So I keep pointing out the same thing, which is you can be honestly wrong, which completely diffuses that entire argument.
That's kind of hard to believe, because, Peter had to have been honestly wrong. Luke
you
had to have been
understand, I
honestly
take it. There are people who honestly believe that the earth is flat. They are wrong, and they honestly believe it.
Okay. Yeah, now we're getting into other stuff, but I kind of just wanted to focus on
just a really obvious example of someone believing something wrong, right?
And really, I could say the earth is round and flat. It's round, obviously, observational science says that, but it's flat for us to stand on. So, we can go back and forth with these things. I can send you a picture.
So, for example, with the flat earth idea, we can provide a massive amount of evidence proving that the earth is round and not flat.
Well, of course, but
people
because,
even with
the Bible
all the
and
evidence,
Job,
they will still believe it.
Even in Isaiah, it says he sits upon the circle. So, it obviously says that the earth is round. And I can send you the verse if you want it.
I know it. It says a verse in Matthew as well that says if you stand on a mountain, you can see the entire earth, which is silly. And I can see why they would believe that.
You're talking about Jesus and Satan. My point is, I think that was more of a spiritual thing. It's obvious that you can't stand on a mountain and see the whole earth. But it did say that and earth also, you got to know Hebrew and Latin too, to be able to get the right translation for the text. Earth also means inhabitants. So whenever it talks about him showing them the kingdoms, he could have took him to the highest mountains and showed him the inhabitants of what, as far as the eye could see. It could either be that, or it could be a spiritual thing, to where he actually showed God the world, Jesus the world, and said, if you serve me, this is everything for you. I don't doubt that in the spiritual, but I'm not going to say that that's what.
If you take it in its original context, the authors believed the world was flat, so that's what they meant at the time, even though they didn't know what they were talking about. But my point more, so the reason I brought up flat Earth is because we have massive amounts of evidence proving it wrong, but people still believe it. But back in the days, 2,000 years ago, with these believers, how would they know that Jesus wasn't real if they never met him or saw him or anything? So
they knew he was real, and they took it to the grave, and they allowed themselves to be executed for it, and they spread the gospel that still.
They wouldn't be able to tell today. Even if someone showed them evidence. Like, how would they find this evidence? How would they know? If you're talking about a peasant living in Rome being asked, like 100 years ago, this guy lived. Did he? I don't know. How do I check?
The writing's on the wall. People are being executed for a truth that they won't deny, and the reason why Christianity was considered. You keep talking about
people being executed,
but people are still being executed now. Even if I can't pinpoint the the exact location based off, archaeology doesn't mean that people are not still to this day being executed. We can throw the apostles out. Apparently there's something that's obviously more important and compelling and powerful than historical documents, is what I'm saying. Because you have this rise in this movement of a forbidden, illegal religion that swept the world. And it just doesn't make sense.
I don't think you get how this works. So the whole thing about the religion exploding later, that doesn't tell you if there was a real guy at the root of it, because that can happen regardless of whether Jesus was real or not. You can still get religions growing. You can still get people believing. The question
yeah, you can, but see, everybody else was pagan. Everybody else during this time was pagans. They believe in multiple gods. So why don't you tell me why?
There were other monotheists as well. It wasn't all pagan. But I guess if you define pagan as not Christian, then yeah, everyone else was pagan.
Okay. So the king of the Moabites, his distant cousin of the Israel, who lived in the east side of the Dead Sea, is introduced to the Bible in the 3rd chapter of 2 Kings 3, as a vessel to the king of Israel about 849 BC. These are all I can pull up.
Yeah, I think you kind of wandering off topic now.
No, I'm not, because you wanted evidence of, and
so we were talking about whether Jesus existed in history as a real person, and then you started talking about 800 BC.
Yeah, and you want evidence. Well, this is what I'm giving you, because whether you accept it or not.
Someone writing in 800 BC couldn't have known if Jesus was going to exist in 180.
Right. Yeah. Well, then that says that he didn't fulfill any of the 351 prophecies. But I mean, that's highly doubtful, because even if you were to take out, I think it said that for one person to fulfill 8 prophecies, it would be like blindfolding a man and expecting him to find a piece of marked sand in the Sahara Desert 3 times in a row.
It would be really easy if you knew what the prophecies were. Then you could just go and fulfill them. That would
right.
Be
so that had prophecy. To be it, right?
Okay. That's only one example. So you can also just make up stories. You can make prophecies really vague and have no end dates. You can cherry pick prophecies. You can make hundreds and then only pick a few of them.
Right. It makes perfect sense to make up prophecies that are ultimately going to get you executed. That makes sense. All right. So,
you keep going back to executed, but I keep saying that's not relevant.
What, execution for what you believe in and dying for the truth?
So because I think it's very relevant. Can be honestly wrong. So if you want to argue for a historical Jesus,
I mean, that's kind of squeezing in. Yeah, that's kind of squeezing in somebody. You're saying that they could be honestly wrong. I think that this is more evidence of someone being honestly right. But like I said, that's just my opinion, and based off the evidence, it's the more reasonable one. But it says, the Christian Revolution in the first 4 Christian centuries, the religions of the Roman Empire came under assault by those proposing a new faith, declaring that only the worship of the God of Jesus would be considered the true religion. As Christianity spread, it destroyed other religions in its wake. Religion that has been practiced for a millennia and that were simply assumed everywhere by everyone to be true, but Christians insisted they were evil and from the devil. So why are they putting themselves in danger? They just feel like just stirring up a crowd?
Well, I mean, people believe in all kinds of things, and sometimes governments outlaw things for stupid reasons. I mean, atheism was illegal, which is obviously a ridiculous thing to do. But there you go, and people were still atheists.
I mean, I don't agree. I don't disagree with that. I mean, because I don't think that somebody's beliefs or disbeliefs should be illegal. We don't have to agree for. I mean, who am I? Who am I to tell you what?
Erman said that the religion grew about the same rate as that kind of religion tends to grow.
It didn't.
His point was that the reason Christianity succeeded was because it was quite intolerant. Whereas in pagan religions, you could belong to multiple religions. In Christianity, you weren't allowed to be part of any others.
Okay, I'm going to read
just FYI, I've got Brady waiting to join.
Okay, yeah, no problem. I just got a couple
more. Or,
sure. Oh yeah, maybe later. I'm gonna let you get back. I don't want to be,
feel free to call back in. I do want to hear what Brady has to say as well.
Absolutely. Do you mind if I just ask just you like maybe one or two more
Yeah, you were in
questions?
the middle of reading something out, so go for it.
Okay. It says, but there was no reason for this culture shift to happen. No historical necessity that Jesus would, in effect, destroy the pagan religions of the Roman Empire and establish itself the supreme religion and ascend the political and cultural power of its world. And it says, how did a small handful of followers of Jesus come to convert an unwilling empire? According to the New Testament, some days after Jesus' crucifixion, 11 of his male followers and several women came to believe that he had risen from the dead. Before 4 centuries had passed, these 20 or lower class illiterate Jews from Galilee had been a church of some 30 million. How does a religion gain 30 million Christians in 300 years? Because that right there.
Well, I mean, Ehrman explains exactly how. Logarithms, basically. Exponential growth, the way it works is the more people you have, the more people will join. So
yeah, but that's his point. The point is there was only 20 people. He has a chart that talks about, he has a chart that talks about, and 30 by 33, which this is all Bart Ehrman's datings, which I would really like to look more into because I don't just take, the datings can be, they're tricky.
Yeah, he admits in the book that it is quite, it's very estimate heavy. It's very much guessing at demographics.
Yeah, there are several theories on the proper dating, but, basically, and I had the chart, but I was looking at it, but I read it to you the last time we were talking. But basically, it was like it started off with just a few because most of the disciples scattered. So there wasn't very many left to spread it. And with it being a forbidden religion, you already know that in Acts, the Pharisees were trying to wipe out Christianity along with the Romans. And somehow that didn't happen. Matter of fact, the emperor of Rome ended up turning to Christianity and leaving all of his false gods behind. But
wait, which emperor do you mean?
Hang on, I think it was.
I assume you mean Constantine, but then he also worshipped Sol Invictus.
Constantine was he's in there.
Maybe.
Constantine, yeah. He converted to Christianity in 312.
Second.
Oh, it was October 28th, 312.
That sounds like Constantine, I think.
And it said, yeah, it says that there may have been numerous conversions, debates with others, and reflections within himself, but he himself dated the event October 28th, 312, at the point he began to consider himself a Christian.
I feel like we're probably relying on Eusebius for that, so I'm not entirely sure how accurate that is, but sure, we'll go.
Well, basically, like every piece of information, that I've given you, you've counted it as either non-evidential or, not taken into consideration. But
yeah, so for example, a guy changing his mind 300 years later is not evidence of something that happened 300 years earlier.
No, it just lets you know that even after the beginning, 300 years later, the Roman Empire was still being saved. You could count the day that Jesus got stabbed in the ribs by the Roman to check to see if he was dead, and water sprayed out on him and he dropped to his knees and said, surely this is the one true Son of God. So we can start.
Story.
It's
quite likely that the reason Matthew came up with that was because of people responding to Mark by saying, oh, well, Jesus wasn't actually dead. So one way you can get around that is to go, okay, we made sure he was dead.
Because
the idea of stealing the body as well. Matthew made up some guards and stuck him in front of a tomb. So Matthew's like doing apologetics.
So the guards in front of the tomb and all that's all false too, right?
Yeah, it's not in Mark. It's not in the earliest gospel. It's not in Paul. It's
that doesn't necessarily mean that it never happened. You don't have to. Something doesn't have to be in a certain writing to say that it happened or it didn't happen. You have to, like we talked about before.
That would be big news. Imagine
Luke
Romans who'd be executed for falling asleep That would have been a huge deal.
Wait, say that again.
So if guards are actually placed to defend,
Yeah, they had to kill
not sure
themselves.
why, they don't explain why, that they would be executed for doing so. So, it doesn't really work out. They'd be killed by the commanding officer. So this is something where Matthew's just trying to make up excuses for different apologetics in his day. So Christianity was presumably being criticized by other people, saying, "Okay, well, this could have happened. This could have happened. Body could have been stolen, that kind of thing." And he's trying to deal with those.
I have one more. Let me think. Yes, ma'am. That last question. How you doing?
Good. All right. How about you?
Doing good. Hang on 1 second. Let me go ahead and mute myself real quick.
Right, we don't have any other callers queued up, so you may as well stay on for now, unless anyone wants to jump on.
Thank y'all very much.
Are you on the call?
Oh, I'm on a call, but I mean, it's not.
Okay.
No, you're good.
All right, honey.
All right. Love you too. Thank y'all. Thank you. I appreciate you dropping me off once. Thank you. All right. All right. Thank y'all. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay. Okay. My last question is this. Matter of fact, I wrote it down. Let me go ahead and read how I wrote it. Do you believe that everyone who has ever claimed to have had spiritual experience or encounter, claiming to have met or seen Jesus, was either mentally unstable, hallucinating, crazy, or stupid?
I mean, you could just have honestly wrong again. So you can have a thing like suggestion, so you can have peer pressure. You also left out the idea that they were just lying. So
Right, yeah, okay.
If there's like 49 other people claiming to have visions, and you got the one going, I did too.
I mean, you're keeping it in a very small circle, and that's not what I'm doing. I'm keeping it very broad because you still, matter of fact, you can type in NDEs and you can see everybody that has had a near-death experience that have claimed to have encountered a spiritual being in the form of a robe. And some of them were atheists, and they're not atheists anymore. So I was just wondering if all of those people were either lying, so we'll add that word in, lying, hallucinating, mentally ill, or stupid. So everybody that has ever have claimed to have met or encountered Jesus was all either one of those things. They were either lying, crazy, stupid, or mentally challenged.
So did you do history at school? I don't know, like, what level of education you have?
Oh, I don't have much level of education. I'm just a very logical person, a very philosophical person. So I don't
what's like
really.
The highest level of history you did? Like, did you do like history in high school, or?
All of my history studies have been self-taught for about the past 10 years from different scholars and historians and different biases and. Because
I mean, like in terms of classroom training, did you do any history in the classroom? Like,
no, I've taken online courses before. No, I've taken online courses. I know how to find historical credibility. I know the things that are looked for and to
so you already
count it
know
as authentic.
If it is, so in actual scholarship, if a scholar trying to use NDEs as an argument for the historicity of Jesus,
I didn't just say NDEs.
Would not publish that paper.
I didn't just say NDEs.
Refused.
No, because see, you're only focusing on one thing.
Yeah, because you tried to use it as evidence. So I have to address it when you try. No. As evidence,
I'm just asking. I'm not using that as evidence. I'm using that as a question. Do you think that everyone has ever claimed to have met this Jesus you say never existed was either crazy, lying, stupid, or mentally retarded? That's my question. And I'm not using that as evidence.
So crazy,
that's a logical, stupid, reasonable question.
It's difficult to tell. So, like, lying can be a lot of different things. It is possible to lie to yourself.
Right, and it's possible that lying isn't in the equation at all. Like, I mean, it's possible that maybe they were telling the truth. Maybe the other 2 million people that have recorded these NDEs are telling the truth. And maybe everyone that has ever said that they encountered or had a spiritual experience with Jesus just might be telling the truth. Maybe the New Testament is true.
So when it comes
Maybe
to things
the
like
documents
spiritual
are true.
experience, when you
just
talk
a
about
possi-
spiritual experience, that's just people experiencing emotions. So if you walk into a church and they're playing music designed to make you feel emotions and you feel emotions, what you'll do is you'll associate those emotions with whatever the subject is they're singing about. So you can cause a perfectly normal person to have an emotional experience.
Right, but see, in Christianity, we don't entertain emotions in Christianity. We don't entertain emotions. That's not why we're Christians.
So Darren Brown did an interesting experiment where he got an atheist scientist, put her in a church, and basically psychologically conditioned her to believe in a god, but gave her a religious experience. Of course, afterwards he explained it to her, like how the trick worked and how he did it. But
Did she claim to have an
experience? Give people a religious experience. Yeah, she
right. I mean,
believed that she'd had a religious experience.
Even with this being said, like, I mean, this really has no strength against all of what I just said. But so, did she say she had a spiritual experience? Did she say that she did?
Well, so you said what? Lying, mentally ill, that kind of thing.
Stupid.
But I just covered one example of someone who is none of those.
Okay, so you pick one person that you believe isn't one.
No,
one person
I gave one example
out of 2 million.
No, so I gave an example of a precedent of psychological manipulation by a cult leader or someone who could be a cult leader.
Okay, so my
tactics.
So my question is everybody that believes in the divine and historical Jesus as being an actual character is what you just said they are?
Well, so you can believe in the divine Jesus without believing in him as a historical character.
That they've been psychologically deceived. So nothing that anybody has ever said about the divinity of Jesus or the supernatural could possibly be true in any way, is what you're saying.
I didn't say not possible, but you would need evidence, obviously. So you'd need to have
I believe that
pretty much everything until you discount things like psychological manipulation and tricks, until you rule those out by having some sort of actual evidence of the truth, you can't claim it's true if all you have is something that could be psychological manipulation. And that's the whole point.
Right, and that's kind of where your approach. That's kind of where your approach is, because you don't have really anything to refute what I've said based off of what you said about how one person was tested and all this other stuff. I have two things. Number one, how do you know
that's not the only example. It's just an example I was giving in order to make the point. But there is extensive writing, extensive scholarship on neurology and psychology, and just like sociology as well, anthropology. There is a vast number of fields which cover the causes of religion, the mental difficulties that humans have in telling the difference between truth and fiction, and how nefarious people can use those to basically create cults, to cause people to believe in them. And you must believe this as well, because of course,
well, speaking of which,
isn't the only religion. There are other religions.
Okay, can you tell me why Christianity, as you say, was invented? Can you say why?
So the most obvious reason would be to counter Judaism. So Judaism was very reliant on money,
why would they do
sacrifices at the temple. Well, just for monetary reasons, to be honest. But they could be honest believers who believed that their God was leading them in a different direction. Judaism splintered off quite a lot into a lot of different sects and factions, the same way Christianity does. There's tens of thousands of different disagreements among Christians about what the truth of their religion is. So this is the same thing happening in Judaism in the first century. There were a lot of different sects and factions and splinter groups. Josephus mentions 4 of them in his histories. So you can see how the Sadducees were fighting against the Pharisees, and they hated the Zealots, and then there was the Essenes as well.
Yeah.
All these different sects fighting each other.
Well, see, and you mentioned something before about how the Pharisees and the Sadducees hated each other, which is true. They did, up until the crucifixion of Jesus and his trial. Then they came together because they both agreed that they had a common enemy, which was Jesus.
I think you mean the Romans. So that their common enemy was the Romans, but even then they didn't like each other.
Their common enemy was Jesus, because the Pharisees wanted Jesus to come like another King David and deliver them from the oppression of the Roman Empire.
Okay, what's your source for that? How do you know that?
That Jesus came that they got disappointed. Why do you think they had him killed? Oh, but
No, I mean,
according to you, he
what
never
is your
existed.
source for
So
that?
none
So
of this makes sense.
do you have a Pharisee or a Sadducee saying that? Or is this a Christian source, which is incredibly biased towards Christianity, obviously?
Right. I mean, you've already made it bluntly clear that you will not accept anything that has anything to do with Christianity and them saying it, which is a confirmation bias, by the
No,
way.
so I'm talking about the standard
That's why I use Bart
methods used in
Ehrman, because
history.
you
So
can't try to use
in
that fallacy
history,
on me.
when you use a source, you need to account for the biases of the source. You can't just blindly trust what the source tells you. Like, if you read Celsus and Celsus says that Jesus was not the Messiah, are you going to believe him, or are you going to think he has a bias? You have to account for biases when you read sources.
Right, I do, and I account for it on both sides. I don't automatically think that Bart Ehrman, everything he wrote is incorrect because he's an agnostic atheist. That's in fact why I chose his material, because you couldn't use a confirmation bias fallacy on me. So,
Yeah, so the way you
use...
account for bias is use evidence. So I'm talking about accounting for Christian bias. What is the evidence that a Pharisee or a Sadducee said that they were joining forces against Jesus? How do you know that?
See, I get your little tactic, because instead of you refuting my evidence, you don't present yours to refute it. You just ask me questions
I'm
like,
asking you
how
to
can you
present your
prove it?
evidence. So you claimed you made a claim, and you didn't provide evidence for that claim. I'm saying provide evidence for the claim. How do you know that these Pharisees and Sadducees fought against Jesus together? How did they ally together towards attacking Jesus? How do you know that? Because you need to provide evidence to support that. You can't just say it and pretend it's true. You need to show it's true.
I can do that. I mean, that's really not a problem, but I'm kind of wondering why. While I'm researching this, while I'm getting the resources,
So in general, if I don't know something, I'll just say I don't know. I try not to make claims without having evidence that I can cite when someone challenges me on it. So if I were you, if you don't,
everything I mentioned was
don't
evident.
make a claim.
Okay, so everything that I mentioned was evidential, and you basically dismissed it all. Which
I picked one example because you throw a lot of things out there, so I can only challenge so many, especially because I can't remember all of them. But I picked the most recent claim you made and asked for evidence for the claim. And what you shouldn't do is you shouldn't make claims if you know you don't have evidence for it, because that would be dishonest. So what you need to do is whenever you make a claim, make sure if someone goes, "How do you know that?" you have an answer and you have it ready. It'll make your debating way easier if you're able to back up every claim you make.
Well, some claims are given during the discussion. So here's the evidence for that. How about all 5,000 manuscripts from the New Testament that affirm it? Or is that none of that's true either? I mean, because you do know that manuscripts are copies of the. You do know that the manuscripts are copies of the transcripts, right?
What do you mean?
So if you saying prove to me that the Pharisees and the Sadducees had this conflict against Jesus, why don't you try checking all 5,000 manuscripts that were copied from the transcript?
What do you mean by transcript? I think that's
pretty evident that multiple people wrote about this.
Okay, what do you mean by transcript?
Transcript, copies.
No, you said they were copied from the transcript. So what is the transcript?
The transcript is the original and the manuscripts are the copies.
Okay, the original of what?
The original of what was written.
Okay, what was written? What is your source?
Why are you asking me the difference between a transcript like a manuscript, like you don't know the difference? I know you're smart.
I know the difference. I'm asking
I know,
but
why are you asking me if you know the difference?
So I'm asking you what your source is. This is basic historical methodology. You made a claim about 5,000 manuscripts. Let's pick one manuscript or one transcript, whichever is your best one. Let's look at that. So which one is it?
I'll send you all 5,000. You can tell me which one's your favorite.
No, I'm asking you to make that decision. So sending me 5,000 documents, I won't read them. I will only read your best case. I have limited time.
Right.
Yeah, so that would be like a gish gallop. That would just be throwing a load of non-evidence out and hoping that one of it might be evidence. That's not how real scholars act.
No, whenever
they will take the strongest evidence and argue from that.
See, this is what I don't think that you
I could
really.
send you 1 million copies of On the Origin of Species. Will you then accept that to be true?
Is it in a? Is it locked in a museum? Does it have any type of
No, I'm just talking about
value
electronic
to it,
copies.
or
I
is
could
it
send you 1
just
million
something that you're
emails.
throwing in there to try to minimize what I'm saying?
I'm making a logical point. If I send you 1 million copies of On the Origin of Species in an email, will you then accept that it's true, or does the number of copies have nothing to do with whether it's true?
You do realize that that's one of the things that is checked for as credibility is the amount of manuscripts for
Yes,
a particular
absolutely.
thing,
Credibility.
right?
I'm asking you to
realize
check for
that,
credibility.
Right?
So I
Okay.
want to see your most credible source. What is it?
My most credible source for the 5,000 manuscripts. Hold on, I got to make sure that
No, just
whatever I
the
pick,
best one. What's your earliest best
whatever I
manuscript
pick,
that
it has
actually...
to be either agnostic or atheist, because if it's anything from a Christian, it's false. We've
No, that's
already
not what I said.
established.
No, so these we're talking about Christian manuscripts. We're not talking about agnostic atheist manuscripts, I assume. If you're talking about Bible manuscripts, they are going to be by Christians or Jews or however you pick. But you claim to have 5,000. I said, great, give me one.
Okay,
Just
here's
one.
the link. And then what was your other question? You said one of them about 5,000 manuscripts. What was your other
Sure.
one?
I said, when is it from, and how does it know? Like, what's its source?
What is the source of the manuscripts?
Physics
Do I need
paper
to send
sets
you that
record
too?
with more than 5,000 authors. Did you just send that link to Nature for a physics paper? I thought you were talking about the historicity of Jesus.
Wrong button.
So I'm going to assume that you don't actually have a source and you were just making
No,
up
I
that
do. I
number.
just picked the wrong one. Here we go. Oh, wait. Sorry. That's Christian. They can't be right. Hold on. Here we go. Gotta make sure that it ain't got
Feel
nothing
free
to do with no
to call in
Christians.
anyone else, by the way.
All right. Here we go.
So, like I said, I don't
this
need
is
5,000
Christian
manuscripts. Let's go for one manuscript or one transcript.
Well, I'm sending you something. Hopefully I clicked the right link that time.
If you believe that your God is real and Jesus was like the original version of him or whatever, then I feel like you should have this evidence to hand, because isn't this the most important thing?
Do you want me to send you all the evidence that I have? Because I can. It might take up the whole comment
just one
section.
will do.
Oh, no, I want to send you more
What
than
have you
one.
got there? New Testament.
Because I know what you do. You try to get one piece of evidence and attack it and say that nothing else is valid.
This isn't one manuscript. This is a whole article. Which one are you talking about?
So
you sent the New Testament manuscripts by Richard Anthony, and it's got things like the Textus Receptus, which is from 1,500 years after the events it's supposed to be talking about. I feel like
okay, so something was dated afterwards. Do you believe Alexander the Great ever existed? Because he wasn't written about until 500 years later. I was just asking.
Well, yeah, and we have tons of evidence for Alexander the Great. Eyewitness
okay, well, we have more
evidence
for historical Jesus. We have more evidence for historical Jesus. Well, matter of fact, let me just go ahead and end this real quick.
So I just said we have multiple independent eyewitness accounts for Alexander the Great. Can you give one eyewitness account for Jesus?
Yeah,
I'm not even going to say like the same quality, just even less quality for Jesus. Can you give me one eyewitness account?
Well, I could say Josephus, but you're just going to deny that.
He's not an eyewitness. Nobody thinks Josephus is an eyewitness of Jesus.
You don't think Paul was?
No, Paul explicitly said
he's not. You don't think Paul ever seen Jesus? You don't think Paul ever seen Jesus? When his conversion was 3 years later, you don't think he ever met Jesus? Like the real Jesus?
So he can't have met Jesus because Jesus already died before Paul joined the cult.
Before Paul, okay. What does that got to do with him killing Christians after, like, what is that? Are you saying that he couldn't have met Jesus?
So it has nothing to do with Paul killing Christians. Paul cannot have been an eyewitness of Jesus. Paul did not claim to be an eyewitness of Jesus. You say that he
could not have been, but he was in the same area in the same time that all this was going on.
So if
the Pharisees had him executed and he was under the command of Gamaliel, then he was in that same.
If Paul had met
I'm
Jesus
sorry?
before he died, would he not have mentioned that somewhere? Would that not be the most important meeting of his life?
Wait, say that again?
If Paul had actually met Jesus, the guy who wrote 20,000 words about, would he not have mentioned that?
Mention what? I
Mentioned
must have lost you
meeting
getting these
Jesus.
resources.
So Paul was obsessed with Jesus. He wrote 20,000 words about Jesus, and it never occurred to him to mention even once that he met Jesus.
I don't know.
don't think
That's
that's
actually a good question. Because I can't tell you whether or not he did meet him. I'm just saying that I wouldn't
I
discredit
can tell you he
him
didn't
never
meet
meeting
him.
him. He might
So-
have. He
so-
might not have. But I think that that's something else that could
I
be.
feel like you need to read your Bible more. You need to pay attention to what the actual text says.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. How many times have you read the
It
Bible?
is funny. Like, why? So you believe that this is a book written by a God, and I know it better than you. Why?
A God? No, I believe that it was written by God's children. And I believe that it was
So
influenced
why do I
by
know
the
your
Holy
book
Spirit,
better than
which
you do?
is characteristic of God. But see, what I've noticed is that, which I kind of figured you would do this, all of the questions I asked you, you had no answers for. You had no logical or reasonable
Give me one example
answer.
of give me one question I didn't answer. I answered every question.
No, I'm talking about, yeah, well, I mean, I could say yes or no to any question, but if I'm saying, if what I say doesn't make any sense at all, then I wouldn't really consider it a valuable answer. How about, what were the motives? What were the motives for people?
We already discussed motives. I mentioned, for example, the corruption of the temple
but
cult.
you have, that's not, do you know what prima facie evidence is? Just out of curiosity. Do you know what that is?
I don't remember the Latin. Why? What is it?
Okay, prima facie evidence is whenever somebody else provides any type of evidence, whether it's documentary or, I mean, there's other ways. I mean, I could list all 21 different types of evidence. But basically, once they present this evidence,
at the face of it.
Right. But once they present this evidence, especially in a debate, do you know that prima facie evidence, it becomes prima facie evidence if they provide this evidence and whoever's debating it can't refute it, and it stands to be true. And they have to refute it with more credible and reliable sources.
So for example, when I provide evidence against Jesus existing, you have to provide evidence supporting it, or refuting my evidence. That's how it works.
Yeah,
so when I say there are no eyewitness accounts, you're supposed to provide an eyewitness account.
Not if I don't say that there's no eyewitness accounts. Not if that's my main source.
No, I mean,
my main source is
if you want to admit that there are no eyewitness accounts, that's fine.
No, because I don't know enough about everything yet to know for a fact, neither do you, that there was no eyewitness accounts. All you can do is assume. So don't even try to make it sound like you have more of an idea than I do.
Accounts. There are no accounts even claiming to be eyewitness accounts.
Okay, so here is, I just sent.
We do have Vlad waiting to join the queue as well. So
okay, well, in the meantime, I sent you 12 secular sources. Okay, and you said that there's plenty of evidence for Alexander the Great. That's great. I hope you know that the emperor, what was his name? Augustus.
I can quickly go through these sources.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Not an eyewitness. Tacitus, not an eyewitness. Pliny, not an eyewitness.
Okay.
Jewish rabbinical
they're all fake. They're all fake too, right?
Everything. Lucian is not an eyewitness.
12.
Celsus is not an eyewitness.
All 46
that's not 12. That's
accounts.
6.
All 46 accounts of Jesus,
Where's the other one?
which is more than anyone else in history. Look it up.
You can provide a million eyewitness accounts that aren't eyewitnesses, and they're still not eyewitnesses. When I ask for an eyewitness account, I mean an eyewitness account.
My whole point is, I don't even care about eyewitnesses. Why are people?
I can see that.
Why? No, I mean we could get into that, yeah. But you're missing the whole point because you think that is the only really defense you have is to try to attack something from 2,000 years ago, and which I would see, the kind of deceptive. Kind of tactic you have there. But
so if you're going to talk about deceptive tactics, you just tried to pass off things that aren't eyewitness accounts as if they're eyewitness accounts.
How?
So you tried to provide eyewitness accounts, and you came up with Josephus, who isn't an eyewitness account. You came up with Paul, who isn't an eyewitness account.
I sent you 12.
And you just listed another 6 sources that aren't eyewitness accounts.
Non-Christian sources, because I know you're confirmation biased,
and you will not accept anything
No,
from a
but
Christian.
I asked for eyewitnesses, and you gave me things that aren't
No,
eyewitnesses.
I gave you documents that I don't know if you're aware of, but it's 12. And then of course you're going to go and
I don't think
say,
you know how this works.
you're going to go and say,
so when
yeah,
someone
that
asks you
person's
for a
not it.
specific
Yeah,
kind of
that's a lie.
evidence,
That's
and
a
you
lie.
claim
That's
to
a
have
lie.
that
That's a
kind of
lie.
evidence,
So
then you
can
need
you
to actually
refute
provide the
any
evidence
of
that
the
you claim to
sources?
have.
Can you refute any of the sources that I just sent you?
Yes, none of them are eyewitnesses.
I'm not asking for eyewitnesses. I want you
No,
to prove
I'm
to me
asking
that
for
they're
eyewitnesses.
false. No, because I'm giving you my evidence, not what you asked for specifically.
I know
I'm
you're not
asking
giving me
you
what I asked
to
for.
refute. Well, yeah, because I mean, you're the one making the claim. I'm the one refuting it. You don't have to tell me how to refute it. Can you prove to me that all 12 of these sources are false?
Yes, none of them are eyewitnesses.
That's not. So you're telling me that if you don't physically see it, it's false, right?
No, I mean, they're not independent sources. They're just repeating the Gospels at best. So they're not independent. I don't think you understand how history works.
I do, actually. I'm
But
kind
I'd
of
like to
wondering.
talk to Vlad. We've got Vlad waiting in the queue. Do you want to just like call in again, or we can carry on?
Yeah, no, I'll
no.
listen to what.
Vlad's dropped out of the queue anyway. You're still the only caller. That's fine. I wanted to give other people a chance to speak, but since no one else is calling in, we
and I
can
don't
carry on.
want to. I mean, we have good. I mean, they're passionate conversations, but I think that we have good ones. We have good debates. You know.
Sure.
You don't think so? Okay. So
I mean,
this is my main
it
thing.
is frustrating when I keep asking for evidence.
Well,
and sources,
I mean,
and you
it's
never
frustrating
do.
to me. It's frustrating to me whenever you dismiss all other logistics on everything
if
and
I ask for eyewitness
rationality.
sources, if I ask for eyewitness sources and you know you don't have any, then before you provide the source, you need to explain, no, I don't have any eyewitness accounts. And
I don't know if you realize, because see, this is the thing. People don't need all this crap to believe that there is a God that they've encountered. They don't need all this that you're asking for them.
You would have to admit that people really believe in other religions as well, other gods. So people obviously don't need evidence to believe in gods.
Well, yeah, I believe that other people believe in other religions as gods. Yeah.
Yeah, so evidence is not really particularly relevant. Although for historical,
how do you know that them other gods don't exist?
Evidence.
How do you know that them other gods don't exist? Because you tell me that I need to read my Bible more, but you're assuming that the Bible never mentions other gods.
Oh, it does mention other gods.
Okay, what else does it mention? Other lords?
What do you mean? What else?
Other gods, other lords?
Yeah, so it does mention other gods, especially
okay,
the
so
Old
how do we know that
how
do we know that the spiritual beings that the pagans are worshiping isn't actually real gods that they're worshiping?
I mean, because gods don't exist, obviously. So
that's your opinion that you can't prove.
Methods here.
But that's your opinion that you can't prove.
Oh, I can easily prove that. I mean,
you can prove to me that God does not exist. Please do it.
I'm sure. I mean, so gods.
I mean, because I would love to get into the cosmological
supernatural
argument.
Means not real, so gods are by definition not real.
Oh well, that's
they're
your
literally
definition.
An argument from ignorance fallacy.
Okay, so
if you ask someone to prove whether something's supernatural,
so
they
basically,
will admit that it's
the question that
unfalsifiable claim.
The question that I asked you earlier, you believe to be true. Yes, is your answer. That if anyone has ever claimed to have ever had experience with Christ and an encounter with Him, then they were lying, because from what you said, it's all a lie, right?
No, I said you can be honestly wrong. You can be deceived and manipulated.
Okay, no, you're basically saying that, yes, it's a lie, the people are deceived. All 2 million of them.
So someone who has been deceived isn't necessarily lying themselves. They can be honestly wrong, which we covered before. You can be honestly wrong about something. And you have to admit that, because unless you believe that everyone from every other religion is lying, you have to admit
I didn't say that they were lying, but you know what? The vast numbers speak for themselves as well, because yeah, other people can say that they've had spiritual experiences with other gods. I don't deny that, because I do know that, I believe, because you're going to ask me for documental evidence if I, don't say I believe, but I believe that there are other spiritual entities other than God. I just believe that God is the most powerful. Now, I do have reasons to believe that. We can get into all that on a different discussion if you want to.
So you would need to overcome the first hurdle, which is the one I mentioned about unfalsifiability. If gods are not falsifiable, there is no difference between their existing and their not existing. So in order to argue for a god, you would have to make it falsifiable first.
Right, and that kind of goes back with all my questions on why in the world would somebody create a lie that was just going to cause them pain, suffering, and death, which you say never happened, but why is it still going on today where Christians are being executed in places like South Korea and Afghanistan and everywhere else? It's just because they like it because it feels good?
Those Christians didn't invent Christianity. They are
Right.
People who were brought up in it or joined it or whatever. So if you want to talk about someone inventing it, you then have to go back to the original cult founder.
Well, I mean, it's all connected.
The debate we're actually having here is, was the original cult founder Peter or was it Jesus? Which cult founder was it, and how do you know?
I think it was more like, was there such a thing as a historical and divine Jesus? I think that's mainly, all I did was add some emphasis on your title. Jesus never existed. I do believe he did, the historical and the divine one. Because everything
so the next logical step after you say you believe he did is to say why you believe he did, and the way
I did tell you logically why I believe he exists, based off of, like, we go right back to, do you believe in universal laws? Do you believe in universal laws? No, I don't. You just have no defense.
If you want to prove that a historical Jesus existed, you need to use the methods used in history.
You just can't pick apart the law of causality, like we mentioned before. What was the cause and what was the effect? Like, it doesn't make sense.
You have to be more specific. That's really vague in general. What do you mean?
Any of this? Okay, well, I'm gonna tell you like this: forbidden religions don't just rise up if they're methodical. I'm telling you, they just don't.
Like, if there's false, you believe that other religions aren't true.
You have your beliefs too. That, I mean, you talk about logic, but I think you set that aside.
You believe that there are other religions that exist and that these religions aren't true. So you believe that religions do just rise up without gods.
No.
You don't. So you believe every single religion is what? There are lots of different gods, or you believe that they're all one god playing tricks?
Well, okay, so. It's funny you asked me that, because earlier you said that I should read the Bible more, and in Revelation it talks about other gods, and Genesis it talks about other gods being here and how they got here. Are you familiar with any of what I'm talking about?
So you believe all religions come from different warring gods, and that this one god of yours can't beat the others?
Can't be the others? No. No. I think that this God that I'm talking about is... Can you still hear me? Hello?
Yeah, I think you had some issues. There was an interesting comment from Meaning Forge that said, what historical tools are you using to arrive at Jesus never existed? So I'm using just a standard historical method. What are the sources? What's the order of the sources? How reliable are the sources? What do they actually say? What is the historical context around these sources? And you have to account for things like corruption over time. You have to account for the copying errors, the loss of data. So you have to factor all this in. The most important thing I think that people arguing for Jesus ignore is the requirement for sources to be independent. So in order to have independent attestation, your sources must be independent from each other. So this would be like an example of failing this would be citing all four Gospels as if they're four independent sources when we know they copied from each other. So that's one source, not four. So that kind of thing. I mean, I can go further into detail if you want. Jim's calling in. Is it all right if you drop out, Daniel? We've had like an hour of conversation. I want to give someone else a shot.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, I'll continue to listen. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for joining in, and call back in as well if
I'll do what I can. I'm at work, and if I get the opportunity to, then I most definitely will. But I appreciate our conversation.
Actually, I think I might be able to promote you. Might be able to promote you in. Trying to figure out how to do that.
Oh no, you already did it. Okay, there we go. Cool. So I'm going to go ahead and mute myself.
Caller as well. Yeah,
okay, I'm going to go ahead. Yeah, thank you.
Hi Jim, you're in. Sorry.
Hey Joel, how's it going, man? Yeah, so hopefully you picked up that I'm the guy asking the questions. Yeah, I guess without using the Bible, the historicity of Jesus. How are you arriving at never existed? not using the Bible.
Not using the Bible. So if you took away the Bible, I mean, for a start, you'd have no sources if you took away the Bible. So that would immediately indicate that he didn't exist.
How are you arriving at that?
So obviously, if you have no sources for somebody, then you have no sources for them. That's pretty straightforward.
No, well, hang on, Joel, hang on. You said you like taking with the Bible, and now we're saying we're no sources. I highly doubt that's a genuine comment. Like, I'm just going to call that out right now, because we do have
everything
sources
we have is dependent on the Bible
that do mention a Jesus character or some type of character in Jerusalem.
So do you mean take away the Bible but keep other sources dependent on the Bible? Is that what you mean?
No, I'm talking historians of the time, historians around the time, around the period. Tacitus comes to mind. Josephus comes to mind. The typical ones that come up in these types of conversations.
Tacitus is reliant on the Bible, so that's not a great example.
Where did you cite that from? He's relying on the Bible.
So all Tacitus is doing is repeating what Christians are saying around 116. And by 116, you've got the Gospels in circulation. So the Christians are just repeating what the Gospels say. Obviously, they're not in a position to go and fact check because we're not even in Jerusalem at this point. The Jerusalem war has ended. So I think if you wanted to get independent from the Bible, you'd need to go somewhere else. But we just don't have anything that's.
That's not true, is it? I don't think that's true, because if I'm mistaken, it's a Christian founder who in Rome who mentions this, and then additionally, Tacitus in his Annals 4, page 11, talks about objecting to hearsay and refuting stories. He was actually a very skeptical historian just in general. So.
Yeah, so again, do you know where Tacitus most likely got that information from?
From a Christian founder in Rome. A Christian founder. When I say a founder, like a chapter founder.
Yeah, I think you mean from Pliny. So Pliny interviewed various Christians, including a deaconess. Pliny and Tacitus were close friends who they communicated quite a lot with each other. So Tacitus's most likely source for this is Pliny. So if you look at Pliny, he's just repeating what Christians are saying about worshipping this Jesus as a god. So it's not evidence of a historical person. And there's also a lot of evidence that the line in the Annals is actually a Christian forgery. But even leaving that aside, even
leaving any number of forgeries and translations aside, I mean,
it's not independent.
The best claim that you can actually make that would be reasonable is the plausibility of a Jesus character existing. Beyond saying he never existed, besides shock value and having conversations with.
If you take away all of the sources, then you've got no sources. So I mean, you have
that's not accurate. Even using historical methods, we have sources. And now we're creating ad hoc arguments. Hang on. We're creating ad hoc arguments, Joel, around these sources and saying, "Oh, well, they're just forgeries."
No. It's not ad hoc to use evidence, and it's not ad hoc to rely on independent sources. You can't just remove the word independent and hope. That's not how history works.
I know how history works, but Joel.
So if you have 50 sources, but they're all just repeating what one guy said, do you have 50 sources or do you have one source?
You can have 50 independent sources of what something's happening.
Yeah, but if you have 50 sources and they're all repeating one source, do you have 50?
Oh, you have one source of that. Yes,
you have one source.
You have one source. You can trace it. Yes, I agree with that statement.
Yeah, so we don't actually know what Tacitus' source is because he doesn't tell us, but we know he's writing so late and most likely just speaking to Christians or to someone who spoke to Christians that this is not independent from the Gospels. So I know you want to try and avoid that by removing the Gospels, taking the Gospels out of the picture and then assuming that anything else you get
is that be a logical leap that you're making? Is that a leap that you're making that they're saying that they avoid, that they are required, like they're So again, going back to Annals 4.
Yeah, so they're not saying anything that the Gospels aren't saying.
Hang on. Tacitus was typically a relatively skeptical. I mean, he refused. He really went out of his way and refused hearsay and rumor and gossip. or secondhand reports where he could.
Yeah, so we have Tacitus talking about Christus and Christians in Rome, which is not exactly the same thing as Jesus. He even says the name Christus, whereas, of course, if it was Christus, he would actually know you were talking about a title, because obviously that being a Greek word. So we don't actually have attestation of Jesus in Tacitus. People often mistake that. They think it says Jesus. It doesn't. It actually says Christus.
There's some Christ figure, some figure in the Middle East, in Jerusalem area, that's being referenced.
Yeah, and we obviously, so we know Christus was a name in Rome, and we have attestation of Christus in Suetonius around, I think, the 50s roughly. So you have independent attestation here from Suetonius of the same figure, Christus, operating in Rome. The impulsore is, it literally means the person on site instigating the crimes. So unless you believe that Jesus was in Rome in the 50s, you would have to admit that this is not attestation of Jesus.
When are we saying that Jesus was he was in Rome or in Jerusalem in the 50s?
In Rome. So that's what Suetonius says. Christus was in Rome in the 50s.
I'm not familiar with what Suetonius exactly says in that regard, that he was in Rome.
Yeah, so in Impulsore Christo, whatever it was, Suetonius specifically says that this Christus was in Rome. There is a separate reference to a Christus in Suetonius, which probably is about Christians, but again, it's a very late source, it's not independent.
Okay.
And typically for history, we want to have independent sources.
Yeah, I agree with that entire statement. I do. That's why, coming out, we're not referencing the Gospels, and we're trying to avoid, to some degree, some kind of hearsay. But even then, with the historical record, I think you and I would both agree on this. The historical record is, back then and even to some point today, is still reliant on some kind of hearsay.
Yeah, so for example, in terms of Tacitus, I assume you mean you believe that Nero blamed the burning of Rome on Christians because that's what the forgery in Tacitus says? Is that what you think?
Hang on, why are you calling it a forgery in Tacitus?
Because there's lots of evidence of it being a forgery, but I'm leaving, I assuming from your perspective it's not a forgery, and I'm assuming from your perspective that means you believe that Nero blamed the burning of Rome on Christians. Is that true?
I'm not. I would probably say sure he did.
Yeah, because I assume you've read the entry in Tacitus, and he says that Nero tortured the Christians for burning Rome effectively. So this is interesting because Suetonius has no knowledge of Nero being involved with Christians or the burning of Rome. So that, again, is evidence of it being a forgery. Pliny the Younger, he would know all about this because, of course, his father was directly involved, or, his adopted father was directly involved, Pliny the Elder, and wrote a history of the time. And Pliny the Younger read that and, was an avid follower of that. So the fact that Pliny the Younger has never heard of Christians before he interviews them, because he says to Trajan, I have no idea who these people are. That means they didn't burn Rome and Nero never blamed them for burning Rome, because it would be impossible for Pliny not to know about that. And even more importantly, Christians don't know that apparently they're supposed to have burned Rome. The earliest account maybe we have of that is the letters of Paul and Seneca, and the late forgeries in, the 4th or 5th century or something like that.
Okay, so then I guess the dumb question that I would ask is, does one forgery in Tacitus' work discount all of his work or not? And then how do we understand which of his work is useful and which of his work is not?
So this looks like a minor interpolation where they just added in a little gospel message, the same way they did in Josephus. I assume you know that Christians forged a line in Josephus.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the first excerpt. It's extremely, it's like lawful. If it's like say like lawful something God, right, or something like that. The first entry is extremely dubious. But even that doesn't necessarily. Interpolation doesn't necessarily take away from the truth of a person existing.
Yeah, so the problem is this is tainted evidence. We know Christians were forging stuff. We know they forged in these particular places. We have direct manuscript evidence of Christians tampering with Tacitus. They wrote like a little gospel message into Josephus, so we know that's a forgery.
What about the second
half
reference?
of Paul's letters
In Josephus?
I mean, that wouldn't even be evidence of Jesus anyway, because it was a common name, and Christus would just mean high priest. So you know, Christ just means anointed, right?
I'm familiar with your argument pretty much down to the level of detail you're going down.
Yeah, so
it doesn't, again, that doesn't necessarily take away from the one, it could be a common name. Okay, I got it, right? It could be a common name. So for example, any person in history, typically speaking, can have a common name. That common name is then applied to other things, so on and so forth.
I just mean, if you wanted to,
I think you're taking the standard of evidence to, especially for historical evidence, to a degree that's not required at all.
Yeah, so my point is anachronisms. So sometimes people see the word Jesus, they think there was only one Jesus ever in history, and they automatically assume it's their Jesus.
It was a very common name.
Yeah, so that's my problem. I have an issue with Christians reading their own ideas into history, and you can't just jump at every mention of the word Jesus because it was just Joshua. We can't just assume it meant that one.
Yeah,
and in this particular passage, I forget it was book 18 or book 20. It's been a while since I looked at it, but there's a whole section about the succession of the high priesthood and the priest Ananus, who was apparently corrupt and had someone killed when he shouldn't have done. And the reason he was replaced as high priest with Jesus the high priest was because he killed Jesus' brother James. So he's quite explicit about this in the passage. That's the whole narrative that's going on there. Like I said, it's not great evidence anyway. It's not independent. It's very late, and then we know Christians messed with it. It's just, it's not good. Plus, I mean, Christians should have seen that. One of the great evidences for these things being forgeries is that Christians had never heard of them until like the time of Eusebius, a man who was renowned for forgery, or should I say infamous. So we have extensive
with Josephus' second account. I guess what I would ask is his second account. If we have records of James's executions, and it separates, because he does separate, things, wouldn't that have any weight? Or are we just conflating James with Jesus?
Well, so people do conflate different Jameses together into one. This is a big problem.
James,
all we know about that guy is that he was called James and he was the brother of Jesus. And then his brother Jesus was made high priest, is the next thing it says in the passage, if you follow the context. It doesn't say why James was killed. It doesn't even say if the charges were wrong or true. It doesn't say who the other people were that were with him. And all we know is that there was a guy called James who was illegally killed, and Ananus lost his job for it.
Yeah, I mean, and that's throughout history too. I mean, even with putting people, I guess. Again, my point that I'm making in most of this, like I appreciate your standard of evidence, and and that's fine. Like you can have that, and we can always have a great conversation on to what degree someone could exist. But with the historical sources, we do have historical sources outside of the Bible. We just talked about
dependent.
The question is on the validity of those sources.
Yeah, so I would agree. We have sources outside the Bible. We don't have any sources independent of the Bible, which is the point I was making. So that's the issue we've got there.
Wait, so you say independent of the Bible, and make sure I understand what you mean by that. Independent of the Bible is this guy Jesus existed. He went to wipe his ass at the forum in Jerusalem on this date, right?
I don't know why you report on that, but I mean, you can if you want.
It's a joke. Like I'm just kind of like trying to make sure I understand the.
So independent is not dependent on it. It doesn't get its information from the Bible, for example. That would be an independent account. So say you had like a court document about some guy called Jesus of Nazareth being killed here. That would be good. If it wasn't just dependent on the Bible for it. Something contemporary would be nice. Some sort of eyewitness account, anything like that. Obviously, so I don't think that the lack of those things is actually evidence against Jesus. It's just not evidence for Jesus.
Yeah, so then you would arrive at a plausibility of an existence.
So you would end up a kind of a middle ground, I guess. So if you have zero evidence, then you'd have no reason to believe he existed. So you need to start from the point where you have some sort of evidence, some sort of positive indication that he existed. But then you have to account for the background odds as well. So Jesus being a demigod, I take it you.
Yeah, I'm not even going to play the divine card. We're not even playing the divine card. We're just talking about a guy who's potentially named Jesus who lived in and around Jerusalem.
Yeah, so typically demigods aren't real. So we tend to, even if it was like a claim of a demigod existing.
I don't care about the divinity claims at all.
No, but that's the thing. So it's a claim. Even if you don't believe the divinity is true, it still has an impact on the odds of someone existing.
Okay.
So let's say Superman. The odds of Superman existing are low because he is a comic book character style. You know, the prior probability of someone existing based on the kind of character they are. You look at them and go, this is a comic book, it's a cartoon, it's, you know, all of these things. Even if you don't know anything about the other evidence, you know that person has low odds of actually existing as a real person, right?
Yeah, sure. So then how do you counter that with, I mean, I'm assuming the additional corroborative sources we would have on major leaders, especially during the antiquity, who were classified to have divine inspired.
You said political leaders, right? So the political leaders is its own category, isn't it? Jesus doesn't fit into that category because he's not a political leader. So I think it's kind of irrelevant, except as an example of how someone would have a high probability of existing. So if you say Roman emperor, for example, some of them were seen as gods, but that's fine because Roman emperor is a category of person who tended to exist. So if you pick any random Roman emperor, the odds are they existed. But Jesus is not a Roman emperor.
Okay. Yeah, and Jesus and this is what I would sit here and say is that one of the major issues with the historicity of Jesus is, besides being a common name, is Jesus. I mean, why would someone care enough to write what happened in Jerusalem? And now that's kind of dealing from an argument from silence type of deal.
Yeah, and that would be a fair response if I'd used an argument of silence, an argument from silence to argue that Jesus didn't exist, but I didn't. The only reason I mentioned the silence is to say that there isn't evidence for his existence. It's not evidence against his existence. So the fact that we only have cult attestation of his existence and no independent attestation from that cult attestation, that's fine. That's what we're working with. I'm not arguing that we should have had anything else. It would be nice if we had something else, but we don't. So that's what we're working with. So starting from that base point, if you ignore him being divine and you try and pick out all of the stuff about him looking like a historical character based on like later gospel accounts, like, you know, of being from Nazareth, being a peasant from a fishing village and all that stuff. The problem is that's not the earliest sources. So you then have to put the evidence back in that you left out. You have to account for him being a demigod. You have to account for him first appearing in visions before he's seen as a historical character. And that's what I mean. When you put the evidence back in, you know, to avoid cherry picking, you have to account for all the evidence. As soon as you put that back in, then you're back on mythicism again, because the evidence is stronger against his existence than it is for his existence.
Because of a lack of it. So
no, not because of a lack of it, because of attestation of him only appearing in visions.
Okay, so Joel, while I appreciate it, I would have to sit here and just kind of looking at it. Like, I understand your argument that you're making from like the religious perspective, and saying like, okay, well, because it's like kind of like this. There's like this foreshadowing of him, prophecies, all that fun stuff, and then of course the gospel sources aren't reliable because they're not They're really not contemporary, and
they're not eyewitnesses.
And translation errors and all other fun stuff. There's still plenty of corresponding evidence in time and space around that time frame to corroborate, again, not that something doesn't exist. It's something did exist, but the plausibility of a Jesus-like character in Jerusalem.
Well, so would it help if I gave you some evidence for mythicism rather than just talking about like silencers and discounting evidence?
If you're going to go with the divinity correlation stuff, as far as like the myths and stuff, I would be very highly skeptical of that to begin with, and I wouldn't want.
It's about the order of precedence, because the question is, we know he ended up as a historical figure. The question is, was he a historical figure first and then ended up as a mythical historical figure, or was he mythical first and ended up as a mythical historical figure? You've got to start from one side or the other.
Okay.
So what we have is the letter of Paul, or the epistles of Paul as a corpus. Are you familiar with Philippians 2?
Somewhat. It's been a while since I read the Bible.
So in Philippians 2, Paul says Jesus was taking on the nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. So he's saying Jesus existed as a celestial being and then took on a body. And then it says he humbled himself, becoming obedient to death on a cross. And then it says, and then God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name Jesus. So Paul says that Jesus was not named Jesus until after his death. And this is a sign of myth. This is obviously not a real person, unless you mean his name wasn't Jesus and then they worshipped him as Jesus by giving him a different name after his death or something like that. So you would have to admit, I assume, that this is evidence against historicity, right?
I just think it's evidence. I wouldn't call it evidence at this point. I just call it it's in a religious book talking about a myth because he's exalted the language.
What would you accept as evidence against historicity?
I think that's the issue, unless I were to find outright. I think the issue that I run into is I see enough sources from a historical standpoint, right, to arrive at a plausibility claim. But I'm not taking.
Can you give it like an example of something you would take as evidence of mythicism? Because if you wouldn't even recognize it if you saw it, I don't know.
Hang on. So let me back up here. When you say evidence on mythicism, you mean that this is just a mythical character?
Yeah. Right? So as in before being historical, non-historical. Yeah, like a pre-existent divine being kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Why would I go down the mythicism route?
That's what I'm asking you. So how would you tell the difference? So you're making a judgment call and you're saying he's most likely historical. And I'm saying, how do you know that? What's your method? How are you making this decision? What would you recognize as evidence? He's most likely historical
because we have sources that are mentioning him to some degree. In and around now, and again, where the difference I think is you and I are going here is you're saying that they're linked to the Bible and therefore they're not good, or we've already established.
Wait, stop. I never said that.
You said earlier that there are no independent sources of the Bible. There are most Bible.
So you made the point that you wanted to take the Bible out of it and only look at things separate from the Bible. And then I made the point that all of the sources we have for Jesus come from the Bible. I never said the Bible's discounted as evidence. That was you doing that.
Yeah, I have no issues discounting the Bible as just evidence right now.
I do. It's the earliest source, and it's the only real source because all other sources depend on it. So I can't discount the Bible as evidence because it's the only evidence we have.
Okay, so now we're changing. Okay, so from a mythical, maybe I'm not understanding your line of argument here, Joel. But the fundamental point again is like we're still arriving at a plausibility of some Jesus character existing, not that he never existed.
Well, no, we're not, because I gave you direct evidence that Jesus didn't exist. You refused to acknowledge it as evidence. So I asked you.
Okay, and what was that direct evidence precisely?
Philippians 2, talking about Jesus not existing until after his death. Now, I gave you direct evidence, and then you refused to acknowledge it, and then I said, okay, what would you recognize as evidence? What's your criteria?
And so now, hang on. So now we're using the Bible, which I'm okay with. Either way, so then we can't use gospel. We can't use the other. So
you can use the Gospels if you can prove why they should be trusted as sources. You know, you have to actually provide evidence and argue for a point. You can't just assume that they can be trusted.
I don't assume they're trusted. They're trustworthy sources, typically speaking. I think they're embellished sources if there's some degree of truth to them.
I mean, sure, we can argue whether there's some degree of truth to them. What's your evidence for that?
I think the common argument there is the details of around Jesus's birth, like in Nazareth. Why would someone say this person was born in Nazareth?
Matthew explicitly says why. He says because it's based on a prophecy. He specifically says this is according to fulfill the prophecy. Okay. Plus, the word they use, Nazorian or Nazarene, doesn't mean from Nazareth. It appears to be from an early sect, so I think it was a sectarian thing. But either way, if it's from a prophecy, then it's obviously not from actual history, so it's not admissible as evidence.
So on that one, then what about the other four accounts, or the other accounts, the other two or three Gospels?
So all the Gospels we have derive from Mark, so you would have to say they're not independent.
Okay, but you cited Matthew as the prophecy.
You mentioned Nazareth, and I pointed out where that claim was explicitly mentioned.
Okay.
So I'm not citing Matthew as evidence for or against historicity.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Okay. I'm not opposed to that.
Yeah, I'm just trying to work out your method. So you see a piece of evidence, you decide whether that's evidence for or against the existence of Jesus, and you appear to always side for existence. So I'm trying to figure out what would you count as evidence.
Well, hang on. I said plausibility of, and plausibility is that middle road that we talked about. It's either he did or he did not, and that's
So how do you tell the difference?
That's a great that's a great question when dealing with history. I'll be very blunt with you. Now you can have, and again, Joel, I appreciate your method of having a very stringent, independent source requirements. Right? That's perfectly fine with me. I don't have an issue with that. But when we look at history,
it only looks stringent when you compare it to Christian apologetics. So this is just standard.
I'm trying to avoid Christian apologetics.
That you would use in any other fields. It's just when you compare it to the arguments made for Jesus, which tend to be Christian arguments, then the standard historical methodology suddenly looks like hyper-skeptical because you're comparing it to faith. But yeah, let's stay away from faith. Let's stay on evidence. Sorry, I interrupted you. What were you saying?
No, you're good. You're good. I'm not worried about that. And
if you have evidence for something, it's not considered faith, because faith is the evidence of things unseen, but what's hoped for. So you have to have faith in some type of area, because just like you're saying that it can't be proved that Jesus existed, which, I mean, I disagree, but I believe that it would be more difficult for you to prove that he didn't. I actually sent, I don't know, maybe 12 sources of stuff that you can look at that actually are contradictory to what you've been saying. But if you want to check them out, by all means, I'll be listening if you want to go through them or whatever. But, I mean, like I said, I did have sources. I just had to grab them. Because I have a
if
folder.
You've got academic sources arguing for historicity, I'd like to read those.
I also have a link in there that shows, because you said that all the synoptic gospels were copied and forged, and but they also have test forgery too. And one of the things that people talk about with the gospels not corresponding to each other perfectly, that's actually one of the tests for forgery, because if it did, then they would count it as forgery, as copy. But since they are not 100% identical. It is actually a good example
of forgery. So forgers tend to argue against other people. It's a polemical enterprise. So when you have Paul's epistles arguing against other Paul's epistles, that's one way we know that they were forgeries. So
I
you
wasn't even
can't call
talking
the
about
Gospels
Paul,
forgeries because they're anonymous.
I mean, that's basically saying that 2/3 of the New Testament is false, and that's kind of hard to believe. But I really wasn't even talking about Paul. I was more talking about, I mean, like I said, like Luke is probably my favorite. And I think I sent some links over there about how he was tested for historical credibility, and along with the New Testament. So they have the accuracy percentage of the New Testament and its reliability. If you want to check it out, it's from non-biased. No, it's actually 99.5%. But
that
if you want to
like
look
a Christian
at it,
apologist talking.
Well, click on it. It's from NBC News. So, I mean, you can claim the confirmation bias fallacy if you want to, but that's why I sent so many sources.
I think NBC News didn't do the investigation themselves. They're probably reporting someone else's.
Right. Well, they do what most people do. They, like, what your method is. They gather evidence and come to the most rational conclusion, which I'm not, like I said, I'm not opposed to your method either. I'm just afraid that you put rationality and logistics aside whenever talking about, the existence of Jesus, because a lot of what I've said is not unreasonable, but you just won't accept it because it's not specifically what you're asking for, documents from 2,000 years ago to be brand new and in your face.
You seem to be using faith as a method quite a lot. I'm kind of curious as to what Jim's method would be, because I don't think we ever covered what would actually count as evidence for mythicism under Jim's historical methodology. I'm still curious to hear the details on that. Like, what kind of evidence would you need in order to conclude that Jesus didn't exist?
I think that's to me, Daniel. I think with the current evidence right now, that there had to be some major head rolling as far as authenticity is absolutely not in agreement. And for many of the sources, even far away hearsay require, like, even Pliny sitting there and going, okay, like there's something happening over here, very in passing.
Well, so Pliny only talked about Jesus as a god, so that wouldn't be evidence of historicity anyway.
Brother, when it comes to historical stuff, man, we can make arguments for many things mythical. And myth.
Yeah, if Pliny's saying they worship him as a god, then he's not talking about a historical guy necessarily, is he? Because that could go either way.
They worship him as a god. As a god is where I would dial in on, as just saying this person potentially existed, and they worship
like saying
him
you worship Zeus as a god or Jupiter as a god. I mean, it's not evidence that a historical Zeus or a historical Jupiter exists.
Jupiter doesn't have an empty tomb. Sorry.
Romulus does, though.
No, then the question then would be with Virgil, just using Virgil as an example, to go, how can we tell Aeneas was real or not real? Probably we would never know outright.
Yeah, it's the same thing.
However, we also know that there was a narrative driven by Virgil. That was a form of state propaganda in some regards for the Roman state.
Yeah, I'm just trying to piece together, so what evidence could we find that would convince you that Jesus didn't exist?
I can tell you. I'm sorry if I interrupted and you wasn't asking me, but what would convince me that Jesus never existed would be the lack of growth and the reasons why it grew, if it was a forbidden religion, and
so nothing. So when you're talking about evidence, you mean like a new discovery?
No, because like
you're not talking about denying existing evidence.
My evidence is a universal law. What you're asking for is documents from 2,000 years ago, which I have sent you manuscripts and links to them, by the way.
I think your answer is realistically nothing, because you said
my answer is realistically in the comment section. Go click on it, and it'll bring you straight to the manuscripts and the transcripts of the New Testament. I asked for
evidence that would convince you that Jesus didn't exist. I assume you didn't.
Christianity
so you didn't post proof that Jesus didn't exist in the
Christianity
comments, did you?
itself. If people were not still getting martyred, if people were not still turning from other religions to Christ, anywhere between 3 to 8 million Muslims
that just means it's a really damn good story. To be very blunt with you, Daniel.
Yeah, well, I don't see why it would. I get what you're saying, but I don't see why. People don't get beheaded for campfire stories. You know, I mean,
they do actually. They'll get thrown to jail. I mean, we have plenty of examples of people thrown in jail for telling the wrong story or the wrong collection of facts and interpreted a different way.
But that's another thing that is a test for its credibility. How much has it changed since it's been written? Or has it?
Oh, we have no idea because we don't have any of the originals. So
yeah, I mean, I think
you have documents going back. You have documents going back 1,800, 2,000 years, something like that. Of how they started writing about Jesus, like you mentioned, after his death, because actually after his death was the resurrection is what like really showed people that he was who he said he was. But nobody wrote about Jesus during his life because, like you said, he was a peasant. Nobody wrote historical documents on peasants, especially those from Nazareth. You know, so I mean, for his life to not be written during his life, unless I mean, he only had 3 years of ministry. That's a very short window.
I find it very difficult to trust the opinion of someone evaluating whether Jesus did or didn't exist if they can't tell the difference between evidence of him existing and not existing. Like if they can't think of something that would prove he didn't exist, then they're literally not capable of evaluating historicity, are they?
No, like I said, no. Maybe you just don't know how to evaluate evidence. Do you want me to send you a list of all the 21 different evidences? Because some of what I sent you,
send me any lists. No,
but listen,
to understand the logic of this basic thing.
Some of what I sent you is called expert witness evidence, which means that
if you were with somebody who couldn't tell the difference between crossing the road safely and dying crossing the road, would you follow them across the road, or would you think that they were incapable of making that decision?
How many people crossed the road and made it safely? Because you like to narrow it down to one person.
This is just a very logical example of a dangerous situation. If somebody cannot tell the difference between it being safe and not safe, would you trust their judgment on whether it was safe?
See, if I've seen 2 billion people cross the road, like what we have in Christianity,
it's a very simple logical
scenario.
Very, very simple logical scenario. They cannot tell the difference between safe and not safe. Do you trust their judgment if they tell you it's safe without being able to tell if it's safe? This is really, really simple. There's one correct answer, and it's a very obvious answer. Do you trust the judgment of someone who has no judgment?
Yeah, but I don't think that's what the case is here.
It's a yes or no question, Daniel.
I don't think that I would trust the judgment if somebody was unknowledgeable of what it was that they were referring to, but that's not the case here.
That is exactly my point. So when someone tells me that they cannot tell the difference between historicity and mythicism, I am perfectly justified in not trusting their opinion on historicity or mythicism.
I mean, yeah, I could use that same method on you because really you don't have anything like strong enough to refute Christianity or the way it's originated.
I've given you evidence, I've given you methodology, and I've given you examples where you could or couldn't you could conclude one way or the other. So I have a method. I'm using standard historical methodology. I'm using evidence, and I will change my mind if I find contrary evidence. I didn't used to believe in mythicism. I used to believe that Jesus was God, and then I changed my mind, and then I believed Jesus was a historical person.
But that doesn't.
Based on the evidence, I changed my mind. So I've proved that I can change my mind based on evidence.
Yeah, we all can. And that's actually what brought me to believe that Jesus was real. And if you want to go through some of the evidence, like I said, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, probably about 13.
So we don't even get as far as evidence, because if you can't tell the difference between what is and isn't evidence, then I can't trust your judgment.
I'm sending you the links to my sources so you can check them out yourself, what I see as historically credible. And that Jesus is in that category.
Yes, and based on our analogy we used earlier, I do not trust your judgment because you wouldn't recognize evidence against historicity even if you saw it.
See, that's the thing, is that I'm not coming at you by myself. I'm telling you that all of these disagree with what you're saying. So you can disagree, we can disagree with each other all we want. But what are the most sources
so there's 3 of us, so we can talk to an independent arbiter. So Jim, from your perspective, do you agree with my logical point that if someone can't tell the difference between
everybody agrees with that logical point. Everybody agrees with that. That's not even.
Can't trust their judgment on what is evidence for or against that position.
Yeah, everybody agrees with that. That's not even the point. So, but what I'm saying is, why don't you check out the links that I sent?
Well,
And
I wanted Jim's
I made
input
sure
on
that they were non-biased.
to check that I'm not going crazy, right?
I sent you links. You can look at them and see how many people disagree with your statement of no historical Jesus ever existing. And these are people that are way more qualified than me. So if you're trying to refute me, then I don't even care. Refute all of what I sent, and then we'll go from there.
No, so that's not how it works. I don't need to refute everything you sent.
Well, I mean, but you specifically asked for one piece, and you
like
told
I
me in
said,
our
I could
previous
send you a
conversation.
million copies of On the Origin of Species. You don't have to individually refute all 1 million of them. That's not how logic works.
Well, this is just 12. It's not a million, but they're different things. They're test to see what's forgery, test to see what's historically reliable.
Yeah, but
Jesus
you
is
don't
the
know
most
what's historically
historical
reliable.
Okay, so
you don't have a method.
I do have a method. I use a method. What is it called? What is it? It looks like. No, that's not my method. My method for finding truth is not faith.
Like I said earlier, you talked about, you quoted Hebrews 11:1, I think it was. You said faith is the evidence of things not seen. Now, evidence is that which is evident. Evident means seen. So you literally just said faith is the seen of things not seen. So you directly contradicted yourself.
No. That is not what I said at all. Like, you just manipulated my words is what happened. That's not what I said.
I'm quoting from Hebrews.
I said faith is what you put in when you have no evidence. You examine all of the evidence that you gathered, and then you invest your faith. Is it true or is it not? Which is more logical and reasonable? You know,
so do you agree that evidence has to be evident to be evidence?
Yeah, it has to be qualified as evidence. Yes, I do agree.
Yeah, so evident means seen, right?
Where's what? My table stall's in the back of the car. Yeah.
Right. The word evident means seen, doesn't it?
I'm sorry?
The word evident means seen, clearly seen.
Okay, well, click on my links and clearly see my sources.
Yeah, so that verse you quoted from Hebrews 11:1, means it contradicts itself. It is a self-contradictory statement. The things seen that are not things seen.
Evidence is the things hoped for, but the things unseen.
Yeah, so it's contradicting itself, because evidence is things that are seen, and it's saying the evidence of things that aren't seen. So it's literally saying not evidence.
I'm going to say it again. Faith is the evidence of things unseen.
Yeah, so it says faith is not evidence. That's what that means.
Yeah, we can all agree on that. I never said that faith was evidence.
Yeah, okay, so I don't trust the opinion of anyone who uses faith to argument for their position. I'm
not using faith. I just linked like 13 sources.
Yeah, so if you're not using faith, then you can use a method, and this method would be what? What would you accept as evidence, newly discovered facts that would prove that Jesus didn't exist to you?
Yeah, I'd say that all of my sources are relatively new, which is another
That's not what I asked.
Testing reliability.
That's not what I asked.
It's like up to date something. Like that's one of the things that you test.
What new discovery could you make that would change your mind and convince you that Jesus did not exist?
If they found his body, that would be one. That would be a pretty big one. If they found his body,
that wouldn't. If you read Paul, in Paul's theology, you could find his body, because
how come
in
nobody's
Paul's
found
resurrection theology, everyone gets new resurrection bodies.
How come? Well, yeah, of course. Well, yeah, because that's
not to mention finding his body would prove that he did exist. So you've just cited evidence against.
No, that would disprove the fact that he was divine. Like that would eliminate Christianity, is what you were asking me.
No, I mean, what would you recognize as evidence that Jesus didn't exist? Finding his body would prove that he did exist. So you've just cited evidence against the position you're supposed to be supporting.
Well, what I was mainly talking about was his divinity. Because this is the thing.
And I pointed out it wouldn't even work, because Paul's theology is that his body would be left behind.
But you know what would happen if we did find his body? It would prove that he did exist, but he wasn't divine. So
I agree.
I think that
if you found his body, that would prove he did exist. That would mean me changing my mind through evidence.
Would prove. Wait, what?
that would cause me to change my mind, because that would be evidence of his existence. So therefore, as a logical person, I would change my mind. So my position is falsifiable.
Yeah, what would show me that, well, let me rephrase it. What would show me that Christ was not who everyone said he is?
No, I mean, didn't exist. Literally did not exist in history. What would change your mind about that?
I think there's multiple things. I think that we wouldn't have any evidence at all. I think that there would be no...
That's not what I asked. I didn't ask how would the current state of the evidence be different. I asked what new evidence could you find that would change your mind despite all the existing evidence?
I would have to think about that. That's a good question. I think that it's multiple answers, to be honest. I do think that maybe if there was one solid proof of his non-existence, period, I think
what
that
would that
it
look
would...
like? So the proof of his non-existence, what would that look like?
I'm not too sure
on that at any point, Jim. I'm not sure if you're still there.
Yeah, I mean that's a good question. I might need some time to think about that, to be honest, because I've never really evaluated that, because I mean, I guess if there was some evidence that did show that he didn't exist, that's a good question. I mean, that's all I can really say.
So history is necessarily speculative. It's always going to be a bit wishy-washy. You're never 100%. So we can't know for certain. But you could have evidence that would tip the balance.
Yeah. I think that if everything was classified, maybe it's forgery, everything that was ever written about him, I think that if it could be proven that he never existed, which I think that that's where the main struggle is, because there's too much saying that there's too many different sources that saying that he did. And even if you discredit 15 sources, which say that didn't mention his existence, then you would still have... For example,
you could discredit 15 sources if you proved that they were all dependent on one source. So, for example, if everything after Mark was based on Mark, then that would mean you had one source, not 15, right?
Not everything I believe was based on Mark, though, because it was just like you were saying earlier. So that's not what I asked.
I'm asking, hypothetically speaking, if you didn't have 15 independent sources, you only had one source, and all the other sources were dependent on that source, then logically speaking, you would have one source.
That's the thing, though, because it's not just 12 or one. It's actually like 46 sources.
Yeah, but if you can't even admit that you might be wrong, even hypothetically, then you could never admit to being wrong in reality. So the point of hypothetical questions... Can you admit that
you're hypothetically might be wrong about Jesus' existence?
Because you sound to be pretty... I could easily be wrong. Well, the evidence is very fragmentary. It's very uncertain. I could easily be wrong. And the point of a hypothetical question is to see whether someone is biased. If someone can't admit to being wrong, even in a hypothetical question, they are definitely biased.
Well, you're biased toward anybody that says anything as far as Christianity and them being Christians.
So sure, ask me a hypothetical question then.
Everybody that is believing in one area is going to be biased in another. I mean, that's just how it works. I mean, of course, you're going to have set on a belief, like your belief is that Jesus doesn't exist or never existed. My belief is that he did. So, of course, I'm going to be, that's the whole point of this call, is for us to go back and forth and see what is the most logical and rational reason to believe whether he did or didn't exist.
Yeah, sure. So I would have evidence for my position. I've got scholarship supporting my position. You have no scholarship supporting yours, but you
don't know that. Did you even look at any of my sources? Did you even look at any of my links? Or are you just assuming that I don't have anything?
I feel like I would have.
Because I didn't just.
So after 6 years of investigating this question and reading all the scholarship on it, what little there is, I wouldn't know if there was scholarship on it, unless you can come up with actual scholarship. Because if you're just quoting news pages and journal articles and casual books.
Well, like I said, okay, so they're non-biased sources, so I guess that the news is considered unreliable.
So
basically
news articles
but if you type in
not
reliable
peer-reviewed
sources,
historical journals.
Actually, if you type in reliable sources, it'll pull up the sites that I've sent. So, I mean, you can call them unreliable.
I'm talking about academic PhD historians or relevant.
Yeah, I quoted
degrees.
Bart Ehrman earlier.
So Bart Ehrman, I can tell you this: Bart Ehrman has never published a defense of historicity, disproving mythicism, under scholarly peer review. He has only published casual blog articles and one pop rocket book. He has not published any scholarship on this. He has not even read the scholarship on this.
But you said you agree with his work.
Honestly, quote Bart Ehrman.
But you said you agree with his work.
I specifically mentioned scholarship. You came up with something that wasn't scholarship.
But I asked in the very beginning.
That was the minimum requirement.
I asked in the very beginning, before all this even started, if you agree with Bart Ehrman's work, and you said yes. So I cited.
Yeah, I agree with some of his work.
Book.
I specifically said some of his work in his area of expertise, which is not history.
Okay, so basically all the questions that I asked you earlier, I mean, you still don't have an answer.
I was very explicit about what I agreed with and what I didn't agree with, and I was very explicit about his credentials and his methodology. I didn't mislead you at all there. You can go back and listen to it if you want.
So I'm just wondering if whenever you find somebody that okay, this is my question. How do you tell when somebody is not being historically reliable or not putting themselves in a situation where they cannot be trusted about what they're saying? Do you have any reason to believe that Bart Ehrman is wrong about everything that he's saying?
Extensive
and all of his books. And see, it's
some
just
of his
kind of
books
hard.
are better than others, yeah.
Well, yeah, I agree.
So you have to take each claim one by one, and you have to consider the evidence for each claim, and you have to consider contrary evidence. So the way history works, you have to consider the evidence for and the evidence against. You can't just cherry pick one or the other. You have to account for both. Yeah.
I didn't. That's why I got my. That's why I got some of my evidence from atheist agnostic, because that way.
So if you're not ignoring the evidence against the position, I take it you've read the scholarship arguing that Jesus didn't exist.
Which one?
So there is one peer-reviewed book arguing that Jesus didn't exist. Raphael Atasta's book is only a review of arguing that Jesus didn't exist. I was talking about
under Bart Ehrman though. Is that who we're still talking about?
No. So Richard Carrier in 2014 published a scholarly academic peer-reviewed argument that Jesus didn't exist. So in order to understand the debate, you have to read that book so you can see what the arguments for mythicism are. Otherwise, you're literally ignorant of the subject. Like you don't know what the arguments are if you haven't read it, right?
Okay, so I'm just curious, like, what made you think that this one person's article is completely falsifying the historical Jesus based in opposition to what everyone else has said and all the links that
So when you say what everyone else has said, are you talking about scholars or are you just talking about amateurs?
I don't know. Why don't you read the articles? You tell me.
I can tell you it's just amateurs. It's theologians and potentially the personal opinions of some historians, but there's a reason we separate personal opinion from scholarship. Scholarship is meant to be peer-reviewed, tested for accuracy, fact-checked, make sure their methods are sound, make sure there's no bias involved, and make sure everything they say is actually factually true. This is why we peer-review these using other experts in the field, because they know what they're talking about.
Yeah,
and there is no peer-reviewed defense of Jesus.
That's why I sent you different links, because I'm going to tell you, like, I mean, we can, like, look, Joel, I respect you. I think you're a very intelligent person. I don't think we're going to get very far because, of course, we're both biased, whether you want to say we're not or whatever, but we're both biased in our own way. And I believe the historical Jesus and the divine Jesus actually existed. I did send links to support some of what I've been saying, and I still haven't heard you make any sense to why somebody would create a methodical, forbidden religion that would just ultimately end up in their suffering and death. But
I'm pretty sure I mentioned it at least twice.
Well, I mean, you said lying. Which, I mean, I'm sorry, it just don't make sense to me that somebody would
you're
lie.
talking about motivation. So I said opposing the temple cult. That's more than enough motivation.
But that supports what I've been saying about why would they inflict pain and suffering on themselves? Why not just commit suicide?
Well, no, they didn't. Paul made a lot of money out of this.
Is that why he was in prison?
Did he say he was in prison?
I mean, yeah. I mean, the documents do, because sometimes.
Which document?
It's like
do we go back to sources again?
Sometimes you bring up the Bible whenever it's convenient for you, but whenever others bring up the Bible, you say that there's no credibility for it.
No, so the Bible isn't a single source. The Bible is a collection of different sources, and each source has to be taken on its own merits.
Yeah, I get that. So, I mean, that's
so when you say Paul was put in prison, what's your source for that? How do you know that?
Well, I'm doing the same thing you're doing. I'm using the Bible.
Yeah, but the Bible isn't a source on its own. It's a collection of sources. So what is your
source? Doesn't that make it even more valid? Because a collection of sources, isn't it? Like, I mean, if it doesn't all correspond perfectly, then
so
obviously...
unless every single source mentions Paul being in prison, you're going to have to narrow that down a bit to the actual source mentioning Paul being in prison?
No, see, because, I mean, I think that this is where your slip up in your method is because you feel like that if there isn't overwhelming, overpowering evidence about a specific thing, then it never happened.
I haven't mentioned overwhelming evidence. I haven't mentioned overpowering evidence. I've said a single source making a single claim. What is your source?
I can still guarantee that you never even opened not even one of my links. But you asked me for evidence. I give you evidence on links, which is all I can give you right now.
So I asked you for scholarship specifically, peer-reviewed, vetted scholarship arguing that Jesus existed. And every link you've provided so far has not had any scholarship in it. It's all, amateur pop stuff, apologetics.
Right. So well, see,
I'm not sure you understand what scholarship means.
But see, what do you define as credible? Because this is my thing.
So I can peer-reviewed academic sources citing evidence using historical methods.
The most accurate one, and if it's by a Christian, you won't accept it. But you'll accept Bart D. Ehrman's work.
You don't have an accurate one because if you did, you would have used it and cited it by now.
Either that, or I'm just looking through my folder and copying and pasting. I mean,
yeah, that's not
really
a
lot
of
stuff. It's probably about 30 or 40.
So generally, if you want to make a valid point, you need to make sure that you're using sound methodology standardized in the field, like mainstream history. You need to make sure that you're using actual evidence that would be recognized by PhD historians as evidence. Because if you're slipping up on those, then it's more like a conspiracy theory reasoning, and that's not great look.
But see, that's another thing. I mean, you minimize what evidence is. I'm about to send you all 21 different types of evidence because what you dismiss as evidence is evidence. Whether you dismiss it or not doesn't make it
I
not
will
evidence.
accept anything as evidence that a historian would accept as evidence. I will not accept anything as evidence that a historian would not accept as evidence. Do you agree that that is a reasonable standard to do history?
Yeah, I do believe that that's one of the requirements for it to be historically authentic.
Right, so I'm sure you would agree.
That's called
you need to provide
evidence,
actual
or
historians style evidence, which would mean peer-reviewed articles or books. Any peer-reviewed academic work by a qualified expert. That's the minimum requirement, really, to be taken seriously.
I could swear Bart D. Ehrman's a historian. I'm gonna have to fact check you on that real quick.
So he has a PhD in theology from Princeton Theological Seminary. I would accept him as a historian. He understands the right languages. He has the right historical context. If he wants to publish a peer-reviewed article or book defending the historicity of Jesus and addressing the scholarship, that's fine. I would accept that. I'm not dismissing him as a source just because he's trained as a Christian apologist. That's fine. But he hasn't actually published scholarship on this. So when I ask for scholarship, I don't just mean the personal opinion of a scholar. I mean scholarship that has survived peer review, which is a quality control process that exists for a reason. It's to stop conspiracy theories spreading. And this conspiracy theory of Jesus existing in history needs to stop. And it needs to be addressed as a historian, as a historical methodology, using
I think people trying to convince people that Jesus never existed needs to be stopped.
Because
sure, if you wanted to do that and you had evidence, publish it under peer review with qualified scholars. It's really the minimum you can do is to address it in the scholarship.
Every logical and reasonable thing that I gave you, that where it's like you literally put logic and reason aside and say, yeah, but you don't have this. So therefore it can't be true.
No, so I'm specifically using logic and reason, and every time I break it down to like the basics, you agree with me.
You're not though. You're not using logic and reason. You're actually,
okay.
I think.
Give me an example of one argument I've used which does not use logic and reason.
Okay, do you think that everybody that's ever claimed to have had an encounter with Jesus is either stupid, mentally retarded, hallucinating?
I already answered this question, and I already said no.
Okay, so then how do you explain all of these experiences with a supernatural being if there isn't one?
And I already told you how to replicate the same supernatural experience using psychology and confidence tricks. I pointed out that Darren Brown did a fantastic demonstration.
And you think that is reasonable? You think that is reasonable?
Yeah, I'll drop it into the chat as well. It's quite interesting.
Okay, I'm going back on you. Thank you.
Okay, did you want to chip in, Jim?
I'm just curious as if you wouldn't mind citing the sources that you use for scholarship regarding this.
Oh yeah, sure. So the best example of scholarship is Richard.
Not the best example. Just send me a few scholarship sources that you're using to make your argument.
The best one is Richard Carrier's On the Historicity of Jesus. I can drop that into the chat as well.
Richard Carrier.
Yeah, so he is a PhD historian who has published under peer review. Yeah. So you should know then that he is a bona fide scholar who has actually published under peer review on this subject. So you know that he has the credentials and he's passed peer review, which means he's done it academically, which is more than any argument for a historical Jesus has done since 1912. So, over 100 years, Jesus has had no defense. So the arguments used by people defending Jesus are simply out of date. That's the problem. That's why every time someone challenges me on this, they can't come up with any scholarship supporting their position. They can't come up with any evidence supporting their position. They can't even use standard methodology used in history because all the sources they're using are Christian apologetics.
Yeah, I don't blame you on that. I think one of my...
It would be so easy to do it properly. Like, how hard could it be to defend Jesus if there's evidence? Like, why does nobody...
Well, or at least muddy the waters, and that's appropriate, I would say. Typically speaking, when it comes to history, is in that regard, especially a figure like Jesus. How do you feel about someone who's not published but is an atheist and a historian, like by profession?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it would be better if they actually published a defense of Jesus, but
obviously scholarship,
you got to take what you can get. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's not a defense actually. It's more like his name is Tim O'Neill. I want to say.
Unfortunately, he's a master's in, I think, medieval history, so he doesn't have the appropriate languages and history training and all context. I mean, if he wants to
why would you say that?
He's welcome to do so.
Why would you say that?
I've read Tim O'Neill's blog and I've seen his interviews. He doesn't have a clue what he's talking about, unfortunately. And I'm not sure why. If he's got a master's in history, he should have the training to do this properly. He should be able to evaluate sources and he should be able to use logic. But
I guess what's your supporting, moments where you're like, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about?
Well, so there's a great example of this. There's an interview with Chris Hansen and Tim O'Neill. I forget who the other host's name was, but they were discussing Carrier's book. And they didn't even know how much the book cost, which is, a red flag straight away. They've done zero research on this. They couldn't get anything right about what the book argued. And they were trying to criticize it without having read it, which is a huge problem. So I don't really trust Tim's opinion if he doesn't even know the contents of the argument he's supposed to be arguing against. I mean, if he wants to read the book and if he wants to actually publish like a scholarship arguing against it, fine, go for it. But the problem with not doing it as scholarship and just doing it casually is you'll make mistakes. It needs to be fact checked by people who are actual experts and know what they're talking about.
Interesting that you I guess like on that one interview. I mean, I'm assuming just those three things.
There was a whole raft.
I'm sure there's more. Like, I'm sure there's more, but I did ask for like I guess your aha moments. Yeah. So okay, that's fair. That's fair. I mean, we all pick and choose.
I can post the link so people can watch it for themselves and see if he knows what he's on about. I like to provide evidence for my claims, so I'll provide that as well.
Yeah. What about have you read his mythicist blog or his mythicist rundown? I mean, I think it's relatively well cited.
Yeah, it's weirdly full of personal attacks. I'm not really sure why. There doesn't seem to be much point doing personal attacks. You should focus on evidence and methodology, So I don't get the point of that.
But I mean, that's just typical, taking a side and arguing it because he does have an agenda. Right, which is to in air quotes debunk new atheist, right? But that doesn't does that automatically discredit?
They've taken the video down. I might be able to find a response to it or something. I don't know why they removed it. Okay, so Godless Engineer made a response to it. So even though they've removed the original video, not sure why, guilt maybe.
Or maybe he admitted he was wrong or something. Who knows?
Yeah, so you can watch it in refutation. So you can see how Godless Engineer responds to the content of the video because he shows the clips from it. So you can still see the original stuff they were talking about. And that'll be the cut down version as well. The original was like 3 hours and a lot of it was off topic. That's probably a good place to look. And like if you want to see where Tim O'Neill gets things factually wrong, what you can do is you can see the clips of him making claims. You can then look at the refutation provided by a Godless Engineer, and then you can go and check the original sources, fact check it.
Okay, but have you read his actual articles? I think like his articles around the Jesus mythicism.
It's been a while since I read them, but I have read his articles on Jesus mythicism. Yeah, it must have been years ago by now.
I mean, that's fair. I mean, we all read things that take a while, right?
Mean, if you think he has a really good argument, we could look at that one specific argument for an example.
Well, he has a series of arguments, and looking at them, they seem to be somewhat well cited. Now,
sure, let's pick one.
Well, I mean, I don't have time to go through every article with you. I'll be very blunt with you because I have to get off.
Fair.
So
that's fine. I always go for like one, but maybe do you want to like call in when we do this again? Probably next week or the week after. I'd be interested to hear your opinion, and it'll give us time to do a bit of fact checking and background stuff.
I mean, I think he makes the overall claim, and again, this is his overall claim, and it's something that I do agree with, which is, I know you may have some problems with. There's a plausibility of a Christ-like figure existing somewhere around this time frame, in this place.
Yeah, there's loads of them. Yeah, there's loads of them.
Yeah. I mean, now to which degree? Like we're talking like Jesus, the Messiah, the guy who died on the cross type of thing. That's where we're probably going to really start muddying the waters and trying to figure out what.
So Jesus Christ just means savior, hero, and Josephus describes loads of characters like that, even though he doesn't say they're named Jesus Christ. That's what he's describing. He's describing loads of Jesus Christs. So we know that this was like a commonality at the time, the perfect time to invent one, to be honest. But that on its own just means, it's plausible that a guy existed. Fair enough. I agree. It's plausible. So where you need to go from there is then you start looking at the actual evidence and where does that lead?
And that's the discussion of to which degree we're talking about the Jesus who died on the cross and that entire religion has been built on.
Yeah, and that's where I tend to cite the earliest sources and historicists tend to cite later sources. And personally, as someone with an interest in history, I tend to use earlier sources rather than later sources.
Yeah, you want to use a primary, I agree with you. Like you want to use a source as close to you as you can get. The problem sometimes becomes if that source exists, if that source survived, because there is a survivability issue here. And then it turns into secondary sources, and then you have to worry about agendas and all other fun stuff that the writer has.
Yep. I think I may have to close this one down just because we've been going for a while. It's been fun. We'll do it again.
I appreciate it, Joel. Again, good conversation overall. I think
thanks to
you
and Daniel, both good contributors. And there are other shows on the Pangburn Hangout as well. So if anybody's interested in all sorts of a wide variety of topics and just calling in and having your say, then feel free to do that and have a look through. So thanks Daniel, thanks Jim, and everyone who was calling in. And
hey, thanks Joel. Even though our conversations are passionate, I appreciate it, man.
Passionate is the best way.
Well, I mean, you definitely give us some pointers to dig a little deeper, which I don't mind doing.
I'm glad to inspire interest in the subject. So thanks for contributing.
Thank you too. And if you have any links, please put them in the comments so that I can check them out. And then maybe next week, whenever you pick back on this, maybe we can discuss them.
So I put a link to the scholarship, which is the most important thing to read, because that's the actual, peer-reviewed work on the subject.
All right, will do. Thank y'all.
Okay, thanks everyone, and I'll see you next time.